Lovely, we're live.
Right, thank you very much, everybody. Can you hear me? It's 6 o'clock, so we're going to start now. It's exactly 6 o'clock. We're quorate, which is good. I think we're still missing one or two members of the committee, but I'm sure they'll join us in the next few seconds. So if we can get underway. I'm hoping we can take things in a slightly different order. And the reason for this is that the CERG report, which will be presented by Councillor Hayes, is one that he wants to present, but he has to be away by 6:45. So assuming that members of the committee agree, we will take that immediately after Chair's announcements. And then after the CERG report, we'll go back to apologies, declarations of interest, and all the other work we're going to do this evening. So if I could have your agreement to that, that would be useful. Other points that I need to make at this stage is Chair's announcement. This is our first virtual meeting, and I know that we're all old hands at virtual meetings, but I need to remind you that you should raise your hand if you want to say something. Alice Courtney, who I'll introduce in a moment, will also keep an eye open, and she's probably much more efficient at it than I am. So she will let us know if somebody's putting up their hand and not being noticed. The other thing is that we shouldn't use the chat for anything other than meeting admin, as members of the public can see it, and it's not suitable that recommendations should be on the chat. They should be spoken verbally. Okay. Live streamed. We are live streamed now. This is an informal meeting, which doesn't conform to the requirements of the Local Government Act. But the leader, Susan Brown, has agreed that any recommendations that we make at this informal committee will be treated in the same way as normal formal recommendations if we were all sitting in a room together at the town hall. Also, I checked out whether this would affect our situation as members who have to attend committee meetings, but no, these meetings will be the same, so you're not going to lose brownie points because you're doing this virtually rather than in person. Right, welcome to Alice Courtney. Alice Courtney is at the top of my screen, and I want you to meet her, at least virtually, because she is our new replacement for John Mitchell. Alice has a background in democratic services and member support. She's been at both ends of the spectrum. She's been in a small district council and a large unitary authority. So we must be somewhere halfway between that, Alice. Since she relocated to the southeast, she's held a role in policy quality assurance within local authority children's and adult social care, and a role providing direct support to the chief executive of Oxfordshire Local Enterprise Partnership, OXLEP. So a very varied CV, and I'm sure a lot of that's going to be useful to us. So welcome, Alice, and it's very good to have you. Thank you. Finally, Tom, you wanted to make a request about the Child Poverty Review Group.
Yes. Yes, so just needing to put this to the committee. Basically, Child Poverty Review Group is going to be up and running very soon. But when we tried to get people together, we couldn't actually get everyone together on any day between now and April. So I'm really just asking permission from you guys as to whether it's possible for us to have subs to come along.
If you're agreeable to that, can you just raise your hand and wave a bit, or put up a yellow hand?
Cool, that makes life an awful lot easier, thank you.
Great. Okay, so I think it's time, assuming that we've got Tom Hayes, Mesh Tuller I can see we've got, we might have Rosie Dickinson as well. Have we got Rosie yet? I can't see her, but that might just be
I'm
me.
here.
Oh, you're here. Oh,
Yeah,
yes. Yes, there you are. Yes. Great. So you're all here. I was just going to say, I don't want to waste a lot of time introducing you because I know that speed is of the essence, is that we will take questions. I'm sure there'll be a lot until 6:45 when Tom has to leave. And then if we're going to make recommendations, we'll do the recommendations after Tom leaves if we have to. I hope that's okay with everybody, but it means we've got the maximum amount of time to have answers to the questions that we'll want to put to Tom. Okay, so the...
just to say there is a hand up.
Oh, there's a hand up. Right, fine. A hand up from
Councillor Smith.
Right, Councillor Smith. Yes.
Just so I don't forget later, can I make a declaration of interest? I'm a trustee of Raw Workshop in Blackbird Leys, a social enterprise that frequently responds to tenders from the council. So it just might be relevant when we're discussing the procurement strategy later on. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That's good. Right, so we asked for a general update on the response made by the Cabinet member Tom Hayes in January 21, not for a response on the 56 recommendations, but an update on how things are progressing. And that's what we've got in the report from Tom. So if you'd like to introduce it, Tom, that would be good. Thank you.
I think will. Thanks, Chair. I'll be very brief just to allow for that extra time for questions. The main point that I want to get across really is just how co-produced this action plan is. So it reflects the recommendations that the City Council accepted from the Citizens' Assembly on climate change that we established. It includes the accepted recommendations of the Scrutiny Review Group into the climate emergency that Councillor Howlett chaired. And it also has additional recommendations in there from other places, but our own views about what an action plan ought to look like. So I want to emphasise that because we deliberately held back from producing an action plan in order that it could reflect the recommendations that we received from the Scrutiny Committee's review group. And I think it's a really good example of how when Scrutiny commissions review groups and councillors from different parties join together and they bring in people from outside to reflect on the evidence and come up with recommendations, it can produce something really meaningful and it can have a direct impact on the policy that the council pursues. I'm happy to leave it there and go straight into questions, Chair.
Thank you very much, Tom. I wondered whether Mish or Rose had anything that they'd like to add at this stage.
Just very briefly, Chair. So we published the action plan in March last year. It is a living document. You'll see the majority of the document that you've received is essentially the RAG rating tracker, which is below. That will obviously change over time. And we were proposing to update the action plan itself and bring it back through the Cabinet process at some point later this year.
Thank you very much. Rose, anything from you at this point?
Not at this point, thanks.
Okay, fine. Right, so shall we open it for questions? I'm looking out for hands, either yellow hands or people waving. Okay.
Councillor Smith has her hand up, Chair.
Right, thank you. Linda.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm absolutely flabbergasted by line 47 in the update, work with Oxfordshire County Council to develop the creation of cycle greenways into the city. Absolutely, completely shocked that this is on red and paused since the start of COVID. I would have thought during the pandemic was, absolutely the right time to prioritise that work, hopefully get it boosted by government financial support for active travel. I can't believe that, both councils have faffed around with aborted bus gates, the divisive LTNs, and then we've got this master plan sat on the shelf with no work being done on it from the look of it. And it, from what we can see here, it's got buy-in from the university, which, or in colleges, which obviously is going to be absolutely critical in terms of developing these greenways. It sounds like exactly what should be the central plank of our policy in terms of trying to encourage people, onto their bikes and out of their cars. So, I'd like to flag that up. I'd be interested to hear what everyone's got to say about it, and perhaps we should have a strong recommendation from this committee that work is prioritised from now on.
Thank you very much, Linda. Who'd like to respond to that?
I'd like to. So I think there's 2 points to make here. The first is that the cycleways are obviously part of an overall transport strategy, and to set a strategy you need to have a stable administration. The County Council administration of the Conservatives wasn't providing that stability in order for us to work up a coherent plan with them. There's been a change of administration at the election, which means all of the parties in this call are represented in that new administration. And as you were just alluding to, Linda, the new administration is getting to grips with being in power and developing transport strategy in line with its priorities. So we are picking that piece of work back up. The second thing to say is that in order for those cycleways to be effective, they do need to link to the other parts of what a transport strategy would be they school streets, be they quick ways, quiet ways, be they the installation of cycle parking and so on. And it's really important that we do develop that strategy. And then I guess the last point I'd make is that the City Council does not have unlimited transportation resource to provide. And so where we do provide it, it has to be really targeted. And in recent months in particular, there's been a need to target that resource and some really pressing issues. So 2 examples that I would give are of Zebra, which is about achieving an all-electric bus city, and also about the bus prioritisation plan, the BSIP plan that has gone to government. And both of those projects have been significantly improved because of City Council transport officers' contributions. We've been able to up the amount of money being requested by the County Council from DFT under BSIP by several millions of pounds. We've been able to request such things as more affordable and easier ticketing, warmer, better places to actually wait while your bus comes. The list goes on. And with the Zebra bus bid, to make sure that we're in a competitive place to secure that all-electric bus fleet, which will help us to achieve our zero emission goals. So it's not that we don't regard the action line as a priority, it's that in a time of scarce resources, it's important that we dedicate those resources to the most time-sensitive things, particularly where they can have an outsized impact. And with the new administration in power and with the transport strategy developing, the intent and the hope is that we'll definitely be able to motor that up.
Okay, thank you very much. There are 3 hands up, Dick, Mish and Nigel. Are any of you with your hands up to comment on the recommendation from Linda, or are there separate issues?
I was, Chair. Yes,
okay,
just simply to add to what Councillor Hayes has said, clearly County takes an overall lead in terms of cycleways as the Transport Authority, and its focus over much of the past year or more has been on the more sort of emergency funded elements of cycling, which Councillor Hayes referenced them, sort of quiet ways. That has been where quite a lot of the focus has been. So COVID has actually, to some extent, sort of diverted resource and focus away from this, but into other areas of cycle infrastructure delivery.
Okay, thank you. Dick, I think you were next.
Thank you, Liz. Would it be helpful if I've got a load of questions, some are more detailed, and I've got a few more sort of overarching ones. Is it right if I just sort of give them like the first 3 or something like that in a lump?
I think the first 3 in a lump sounds a sensible way to
sort of thing. Otherwise, it's not practice. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So thank you very much for the report. A major question that arises. I mean, what I've actually done, I've spent today chewing through this report and setting it, cross-referencing it to the 56 recommendations that came from our scrutiny panel on this, which did a fantastic amount of work. I would comment by saying that actually that action plan demonstrates that we're actually moving quite fast, I think, depending what an emergency requires, against those recommendations. Looking at the recommendations already in the action plan, we've got more than half of them reflected, which is encouraging. And in fact, it's better than that. And I just wanted to ask you a question about this. I've got a list here of the cross-references to the 56 recommendations. And there's a whole chunk of them concerning biodiversity, which have not yet been addressed. But I picked up that the council is currently recruiting a new ecologist and biodiversity manager. My guess is that that person, when appointed, will find those, I think there's about 8 or 9 of those recommendations, that they'll find them in their job description. I'd just like to be confirmation that that is the case, because if that is the case, then in fact there's a whole chunk of about 8 or 9 of those action points which were picked up by that new person. And I'd be interested to know whether that new person has been appointed yet, whether we're getting applications, that sort of thing. So that's one. Second question is a sort of overarching one, but my sort of engineering scientific background many years ago, it sticks in my brain, it niggles away at me, and this is about our definitions. One of the points out of the scrutiny panel work was about emissions related to procured services. Now, there's not direct emissions, but emissions related to the services that we procure, indirect, and including those same emissions in our city carbon accounting. Now, that is a biggie. And it hasn't been addressed in our action plan, and that's not entirely surprising because it's a biggie. It also relates to the Zero Carbon Oxford partnership. And it's a question around definition of net zero. Net zero, I am coming to realize, is a really problematic concept because it depends, you know, what you're including in net zero and what you're not. Now, the Zero Carbon Partnership, I read through all that stuff, and it's adopted a definition which obviously includes our direct emissions as a city, that's obvious, but there's what they call scope 3 emissions, which are the indirect ones, and they are absolutely a can of worms. And I think most organizations pick and choose between what they're going to include when they're dealing with net zero. This issue about the emissions related to our procured services falls into that camp. Which is probably why it hasn't been addressed in our action plan. So I want to, I think I want to ask a question about it, but I also want to make a plea that to avoid confusion, to avoid cynicism in public and things, it would be very helpful if we can be very clear what is and what isn't included in our net zero claims. And there's one, if I can draw a specific example, that features in the report that we've got in section 5, paragraph A, I think it is, where we talk about the 80% reduction in the council's carbon footprint achieved over the past decade. Well, yes, that is true. There is a 40% reduction that we can count, but most of that, I think, and I'd be good to have it confirmed, is down to the fact the national grid has decarbonised by that amount, and that has reflected directly in our own emissions. So you see what a can of worms this whole thing about net carbon is. Some have said don't even use the phrase. I don't think there's any choice. We have to use the phrase because we're never going to be zero carbon. So it's always going to be a matter of compromises, and we've got to be really, really so clear about our definitions. My plea is that in all our reports, both the Zero Carbon Oxford Partnership and everything, we spell out at the top of the page for the public exactly what is and isn't included in our indirect emission calculations. So I think I've talked enough for now, but that's a real big one. In some organisations, those indirect emissions are by far the majority of their emissions, rather than the direct ones.
We've got those 2 points. Shall I ask Tom and Mish and Rose if they'd like to respond on both of them?
Oh, I'm immediately passing this football to Rose. I mean, Rose is excellent on this topic. What I will say, though, Dick, is the point that you're making around trying to address any possibility of cynicism or mistrust is really important, because to get to our goals, we're going to have to take people on a significant journey at some speed, and people need to know that they can trust us, that what we say we're going to set out to do and how we think we can do it can be completely trusted. Over to you, Rose.
So yeah, the definition of net zero was the subject of the December cabinet paper, and what we were trying to do in that cabinet paper is tackle exactly what you were saying in relation to the sort of definition of net zero and the different interpretations of that, and the fact that there's kind of no internationally agreed definition of what net zero is. So in that cabinet paper, we wanted to set out what we meant by net zero, and we took advice from Professor Nick Eyre as our scientific advisor on that. At the moment, so the greenhouse gas report, the City Council's greenhouse gas report and the carbon management plan sets out exactly what emissions we're sort of monitoring at the moment and how we're accounting for them. And we also committed in the carbon management plan to tackle the big issue of Scope 3 emissions, and the Zero Carbon Oxford Partnership is also committed to look at Scope 3 emissions, because it acknowledges also that it's an enormous area for all organisations involved, and it's really hard to get a baseline or get the data together. So the first step will be to work towards getting the data together for those Scope 3 emissions, and then once we have that, then begin monitoring it. But I think clarity about what we mean by net zero, both in relation to the City Council, the Zero Carbon Oxford Partnership, but then also when we get on to talking about buildings, it's going to be really important to be really clear about what we're meaning every time we kind of mention the word net zero. Yeah, and I suppose on procured services, maybe that will be covered in the, you said you were talking about the procurement strategy later, but I think we do need to have a conversation about what we're doing in relation to procurement, and that's a commitment that was also in the carbon management plan, but I think it's also an action in this document as well. I don't know if I've answered that completely enough, but I hope that's helpful.
Shall I pick up on your first question, Councillor Wolf, the question about biodiversity? So the short answer is yes, we do have a biodiversity officer now on board. Tristan Carlisle is his name, and we're very, very pleased to have him on board. So we're now we've got a stronger resource in biodiversity than we've had hitherto. In terms then of the action plan, just to be clear, the action plan includes those elements of the scrutiny review report recommendations that were agreed by Cabinet at the time. There are recommendations relating to biodiversity in the action plan here, and which we're sort of moving forward. There are others, as you rightly say, that were in the scrutiny review report, which don't appear in the action plan at the moment. But as we are refreshing the action plan and we now have resource to do more stuff in the biodiversity space, that work is not lost. We will obviously go back to the scrutiny review report and have a further look, and we'd make recommendations to Cabinet about what additional things we might want to then take forward further in that space. So on biodiversity, it's a very live topic. There's a lot of very important work going on anyway around biodiversity net gain, which has got sort of statutory basis to it. So that's at the moment, that's sort of top of Tristan's pile. But there's a huge range of different things for him to look at. Absolutely.
And just to add to that slightly, the biodiversity strategy that was passed last year is a really important foundational document for the officer to be working alongside the documents that you've got in front of you tonight. And there's further work that needs to be done in the form of a very specific action plan, because as Mish was saying, there's so much you could do in this realm. There's so many potential funding opportunities coming up that we need to make sure we target our resources appropriately.
Thank you. Can we move on to Nigel? Your question, Nigel.
I've got a number of comments. Thank you, Tom, and colleagues for the report, which I think is generally good, but I'll make a couple of observations and a couple of questions. There's some inconsistency in the text around the dates of things. So sometimes we talk about zero carbon Oxford as a city being a 1.2050. Well, that's not a figure I've ever heard. It's 2040 from my memory. And also the council zero carbon status, as it were, with its own activities is sometimes wrong in the thing. So you might just want to go back and check that, because there's some mistakes, frankly, in that. Secondly, I think you are a bit kind on yourself sometimes in your RAG ratings, because you've got two issues. Sometimes you have to devise a strategy to do something, which I accept takes time. And then you have to get the resources to carry it out. And you tend to give yourself quite a lot of brownie points for working up a strategy when you haven't got any money. And there's quite a lot of examples like the EV vehicles thing. I mean, that at the moment, we do not have enough money, as far as I understand it, to carry out the sort of strategy we would like on that, which is a good strategy. And there are other areas as well. So I just think, if we're going to be kind of honest with ourselves about progress, we should be a little bit harder on ourselves about where we may have a plan or a view, but we don't actually yet have the resources. We haven't applied to government for them, or they're just not available. And that's it's just the way life is. Third issue for me is I'm curious, when we come up to talk about transport, which actually doesn't play much of a role in this report, we talk about Connecting Oxford, and there's a line about implementing some parts of Connecting Oxford in 2023. I'd love to know what those parts are, because as far as I'm concerned, Connecting Oxford hasn't been presented in a coherent fashion for quite a while, and nobody quite knows what the status is. So I'm quite surprised you are as confident as you appear to be that parts of Connecting Oxford will be introduced in 2023. And finally, again, it's this, I think, maybe a drafting issue. You've got references to community grants and making community grants relate to environmental priorities. But again, as far as I'm aware, our strategy on community grants has now been agreed, and we are carrying it through. And we are about to award grants in the next couple of months. So to say it's sort of still work in progress, I think isn't entirely honest. I mean, we've pinned our colours to the mast, haven't we? That the grants programme should relate much more directly to the council's priorities, including its green priorities, which I fully support. But I think we should say so. It's not really a work in progress. So those are some of my observations about some of those are drafting issues, but I'm particularly intrigued and curious about the Connecting Oxford elements, which we're promising to introduce in 2023. And I'd love to know your answer to that question.
Thanks. Two quick responses. First of all, on the EV strategy side of things, I would imagine that is green because we have commissioned the strategy. It's gone through Cabinet. The report is set to come back in March. It was commissioned to be providing a strategic response to the fact that we've got invitations to partner with this or that company falling out of our ears to introduce EV charging. So the expectation is that by having a strategic approach, which makes sure that we target EV charging infrastructure into the communities that need them, also the communities that don't presently need them but could benefit from them in order to develop a market there, we're confident that we can bring in the funding to make that EV strategy work. One of the explicit recommendations of the Cabinet paper authorising the setup of the strategy too was that we would explore a role for ODS in providing electric vehicle charging infrastructure, and that potentially being a way of monetising our knowledge and skill in this area and opening up a new income stream for the council. So I think that's probably why we've got that on a green there, Nigel. In terms of Connecting Oxford, the publicly stated timetable is for an introduction in 2023, and that's why we've got that reflected here. It's also worth saying that as part of some of the work I was alluding to in the first answer, to secure investment into Oxford, particularly in our bus fleets, we're intending that some of that investment would be used to support the development of Connecting Oxford. Now, clearly, Connecting Oxford is going to be a transformational change in the city. And so we need to make sure that, as with all transport projects, we're working alongside our communities, we're properly consulting them. And so I can see why you might think that 2023 is quite near, but there's a level of confidence that at this point in time, with the administration getting its feet under the table, with our knowledge about what funding could come into the city and with what work has been done so far, that it's a timetable we're prepared at the moment to stick to. Mish, do you want to add anything to that?
Well, can I come back and say, I think therefore in the paper, I mean, that's a more rounded answer, if I might put it that way, than is in the paper, and explain the context. I think the line, some parts of this will be introduced in 2023 in the rather bald way in which it's there, is not helpful, frankly. And I think if I were in your portfolio, Mr. Hayes, I would go back and look at the introduction to the paper and maybe reflect some of the subtleties of your position and our position on this, rather than the rather bald way which is expressed in the RAG ratings. But I'm not there to tell you how to do your job, okay? But
you are here to tell me how to do my job.
Well, not the details.
That's the rule of scrutiny. That's the rule of scrutiny.
Touche, but I don't want to grandmother suck eggs type situation. You know what I mean? But you know what I'm driving at.
I do. I understand entirely what you're saying, Nigel. I guess what I'd say is that the simple insertion, a copy and paste, as it were, from a press release about what the intent is around Connecting Oxford explains why it might appear a bold statement. And in giving a rounded answer, I was trying to add new information that perhaps wasn't in the report. I take the point about possibly caveating such a bold statement in future documents in order that people understand what the intent is, but the reason for it. And I think we can make sure that we do that. It's a good point. Thanks, Nigel.
The other, just final observation from me. I mean, I heard your answer to Linda earlier on. All I could say is I hear you, right? But I think actually the county council's kind of been deciding the priorities here, and they've decided they want to have LTNs and they want to have quickways, and they haven't been throwing their heft behind cycleways. That's the truth. And your bigger point is right, that unless these things are presented holistically, so you connect up literally and metaphorically the different parts of the transport strategy, including cycleways, then it just won't work. It just won't work. You know, the piecemeal presentation just does not work and does not convince. And therefore, I think we've got to put even more pressure on them to look at the cycle weighting, which I suspect is one of the least contentious parts of the strategy, actually, and therefore the one that's most likely to garner public opinion and give it momentum in the best sense of that word. While if you take the difficult bit, the really difficult, problematic, divisive bits and put them up first, that's much more hard to persuade people to go along on the journey. So I think tactically, my personal view is tactically they got that wrong. And I'd like you to pass that back to them when you get the opportunity.
I shall endeavour to do that as I intend to. I guess what I would add to the answer I gave to Linda earlier is, yes, of course, it's around making sure the bus improvement plan and Zebra are on course, that we meet quite tight government timetables to get information to them, to keep the hope alive of getting those two bids into success territory. Obviously, LTNs have been a diversion, and we've been quite clear with the County Council publicly about the recognition of that. We've also made the point too that the introduction of East Oxford LTMs could have a wider impact on transport, which actually undermines the bid that we're supporting them on in order to get an all-electric bus fleet and to have a bus improvement plan. So the point that we make repeatedly about this needing to be a joined-up strategy is absolutely critical. I guess what I would say is, while this recommendation refers to cycleways linking outside of Oxford to the city centre through key corridors, it is worth saying that within the city itself, the only way we can really free up safe, segregated cycle space in order to boost cycling uptake is by reducing the number of cars on the road, which involves having plans like Connecting Oxford Progress.
It sounds as though,
thank you, Tom. Thank you.
It sounds as though we may have a recommendation coming up about the cycleways, doesn't it? We need to move on fairly quickly.
Shall I just pick up the other questions that Councillor Chapman raised just very briefly, and I think one illustrates the other. On the RAG ratings and the generosity, I think we were as objective as we felt we could be around what the state of delivery. I take your point that in some cases we're delivering a plan or a strategy rather than the actual actions, but that hopefully is clear in terms of what we're saying. In terms of the community grants, we might have actually underscored ourselves then, because you're right, that has, I think it's come through drafting. We now have that cleared document around community grants strategy of which taking into account environmental benefits is now written into the way in which grants are administered. So we may be able to turn that one blue.
Thank you very much. Can we move on to Chris, your question, please?
Thank you. So on theme with the questions so far, it's a multitude of small popcorn. I shared these with Councillor Hayes in advance. So if it's okay, let's go back and forth rather than my ask 6 little questions and see whether he can remember all 6 of them. So number 1 was about action points 5 and 6, which related to fleet vehicle electrification / alternative fuels. Both of those previously had warnings attached to them indicating that they had funding, that they didn't have funding at all, and they're being merged into another action. Could you clarify what is the funding status of action point 4 that they're being merged into?
Yeah, and just before I do, I want to thank Councillor Smelton for getting in touch ahead of time with those questions, because it meant we could go away, prepare the information, come back and really use Scrutiny as effectively as possible, which is what we want. The answer is that we don't actually have a budget currently identified to go beyond the 25%. So what's really important here is to flag that there's a lot of uncertainty around what the cost might be for particular types of vehicles we use, or a different approach that we can take with different cost impacts. We've been fortunate, well, I say fortunate, actually, the record of the city in having ambition and a record of delivery alongside it has meant that we've secured investment to the city, such as Energy Super Hub Oxford, which has been enabling us to invest in the swifter acceleration of our electrification of our fleet. So the intent really is that we also keep on building our profile, keep on delivering, keep on trying to attract investment into the city, which can help support the further electrification of our fleet. But as yet, we don't have a budget to go beyond 2023. ODS will come back with updates on that fairly soon.
Thank you. action point 13 talked about charges that were intended to be levied relating to energy consumption, but said that they weren't workable. Could you mind elaborating what charges they would have been and what happened that made them unworkable?
So the feedback that I've got from the housing team is that council house rent levels are capped by government. Rents cannot be increased to pay for retrofit measures on homes, even where the tenant will see a reduction in energy bills as a result. We, as a council, have researched several separate charges to these tenants as a way of recouping the cost of retrofit, and we've concluded that it isn't workable. Therefore, the only option left to us is to utilise HRA capital identified for this purpose and seek significant additional funds from government for retrofit. And Mish, can you correct me on this? I seem to remember we've got a bid going in fairly soon for additional funding. We got the £400,000+ for retrofit work at the back end of last year.
Yes, that's right. So we've actually the latest bid that we've been awarded is for the private sector. So it'll be for homeowners and for private rented sector landlords. We've got a pot of about 1.7 million that we'll be encouraging those people who can qualify to bid into. But there's going to be we would expect a long chain now of these different bidding opportunities, and what we want to do is to sort of, using the experience we developed on the work that we've done so far, is to accelerate the programme.
Right, Chris, do you have any
Thank
more?
you. Yeah, and immediately below it, number 14, just used some language that I didn't really know what it meant. It talked about, it's particularly at the end of action point 14, it describes action in lieu of energy bills, and I just wasn't really sure what that was referring to.
So the answer I've got is to improve the business case for building to passive house equivalent. We have, as part of the HRA strategic review, considered the longer term costs of needing to retrofit when new homes are not built to these standards. This has been taken into account when setting our overall HRA budget envelope for the next 10 years for new supply purchase from OCHL. OCHL are improving on building regs across the delivery programme and working on a model that's passive house equivalent for the affordable market. We're already delivering a 70% improvement on building regs, which will still be a 40% improvement when the building regs themselves are updated.
Okay. I doubt it's worth making actual formal recommendations and stuff like this, but if it's possible to include a bit of that in the document so that it just stands by itself a bit better would be great, especially for people like me who are seeing it for the first time and don't know what it looked like the first time around. Point 15 talked about a high rate of refusals. I just wanted to know, I specifically asked you whether the refusals by tenants was due to costs to them, either in time or in money, but just in general, do we know what the reasons for refusals were?
Yeah, the reasons aren't down to cost. It's down to a range of other things, such as concern about people coming into home, needing to be persuaded or having the case made to them that typically a warmer home is a cheaper home, concern around disruption. I mean, my mum lives in a council home back in Salford, and she's been asked by her council if she wants to have energy efficiency upgrades, and her response immediately was no, because she couldn't handle the idea of the builders coming into a clean home. So it's being able to address some of the concerns around that, really. There's a tenant engagement piece of work which is set to start fairly soon, which is intended to make just that case to tenants so that they feel more comfortable about letting the council into their homes. And I think it just emphasises something: we don't do anything without the consent and cooperation with our tenants. We do everything really closely.
I think, Chris, that we probably need to move on to Marina, because I'm aware that we've got a very limited amount of Tom's time this evening. Is that
Liz,
okay?
Yeah, Liz, I can at breakneck speed, without receiving the questions from Chris, I can give you the answers, and then you've got them, and I'll refer to the number points, and then they can go to the minutes. So okay. Action point 28, there's a question raised. The response is that the consultants were unable to meet our standards or timescales, and we're currently negotiating with them around fee payments. For action point 39, where we are planning repairs and maintenance, we will endeavour to plan for future carbon saving measures. So Chris, what I'll do is I'll put this into an email so you've got the responses specifically to your individual questions, and I'll copy in Tom Hudson at the same time so he can more easily write the minutes.
That would be brilliant. Thank you.
Thanks.
Great, thanks very much. And so on to Marie, okay.
Yeah, so I had two questions. One was actually on 28, which isn't quite covered, which is what's the timescale for the new conditions survey, particularly interested around community buildings. And then shall I ask my second one straight away?
Yes, please.
Okay, my second is a bit more of a grumpy one from me, I'm afraid. I mean, I think there's some absolutely fantastic work that's been going on, hugely ambitious, and, you know, hats off to all of those who've been involved in that. But really, we are a council that leads the way on tackling equality for all our residents and thinking about that across our policies. And I just really felt that, you know, the impact, equality's impact at the end of this document, no adverse impacts on any part of the community have been identified. I just really don't think that that is good enough and gets to the granularity of the way that some of these individual policies and strategies play out in detail for certain groups, in particular those with disabilities, but also cumulatively how some of those policies have an impact on those groups, and making sure that they're involved as early as possible. You know, just as a reminder that the UN Department for Economic and Social Affairs have highlighted that persons with disabilities are disproportionately affected by the adverse impacts of climate disasters and are at greater risk of death, injury, and additional impairment. And, you know, one of the things that the UN has argued is that meaningful participation of disabled people in policy making in this area at all levels leads to tailored climate action, which would enable better identification of risk reduction and adaptation measures to mitigate and minimize the adverse impacts of climate change on disabled people, but it also benefits everybody else too. And you know, there's not one mention of disability in this report. There's not one mention of the inclusive movement and transport group, which is something that I set up with colleagues, officer and cabinet colleagues 2 years ago. And some of the work that they've done, but often that group, you know, itself gets frustrated because pieces of work arrive far too late. So with huge respect for all those who are involved in this work, a real plea, please, that this issue is taken much more seriously than it is currently and is embedded much earlier on in all of the work around climate action and the design work right from the beginning of these pieces, and especially as they are reviewed and revisited going forward.
So, well, first of all, thanks for that, Marie. And we'll take the thanks for the work back to the other officers who have contributed to it but aren't in this meeting. I think the first thing to say around the timescale is that there isn't yet a timescale. It's being worked up. I think Ed might actually be presenting some more information about that this week. On the second point, the larger point you make, I mean, you know, hands up in the air, you're completely right. When you read through what inequalities impact ought to say in a report like this, it should go into greater detail than it does here. It should be more conscious of the possible adverse effects that can arise. If I'm looking for an explanation, I think it's because it's an overall update on where we are. It's not trying to get into how each individual policy against particular equalities efforts is being scored. It's trying to give that overall picture. But I think you're right that we're not going to achieve a fair transition unless we properly consider people from all backgrounds. I know we've discussed disability politics before, and it's not a person's disability that impairs them, it's the way society treats them. And I think if we're not properly treating people with disabilities as we try to achieve a zero carbon city, then we're not building a better city. So I just want to say sorry for that. If you feel like it's not reflected, I think you're right to say it's not. And we'll take that back and we'll make sure that we do better in future reports.
Thanks very much. Have we got time for a question from Paula? She hasn't spoken yet, and I can see her hand up before you leave, Tom. Okay.
Thank you. Oh, thanks so much. It was just to follow on from what Marie was saying, because I just wanted reminding on how the community assembly was set up and if it had solid representation on that with disabled people and people from lower social economic backgrounds included in those discussions.
So the quick answer is yes, but as with passing the football to Rose on net zero definitions, because she's excellent on that, I'm going to pass this to Mish who basically set up the assembly from an officer point of view and worked with Ipsos Mori and the representativeness.
Yeah, so in short, absolutely yes. We also got a report on this somewhere, which I can dig out and send to you. Their methodology was very clear, which is that they needed to achieve a representative sample. Given that we were talking about, a relatively small number of people, of course, that representative sample is never going to be exact. But I do recall we had people with disabilities there. Those of us who attended, we met everyone. So yes, we did.
Thank you.
Can I just ask a question very quickly? Chair's privilege, I suppose. It's on some of the actions, 3035, not able to engage with citywide landlords or commercial tenants, no capacity. That's obviously concerning because these are very important ways forward that we're going to have to explore. Is the capacity going to be any better? Are you putting items in the budget to cover funding for posts for these people so that they can begin to engage with landlords and tenants?
Do you want me to pick that up? Yeah, I mean, actually, on the we were, funnily enough, we were discussing just today. I was in a meeting this morning with Ian Wright, where we were talking about the private rented sector and sort of action in that space. So I think that is something that is going to pick up in the year. When it comes to the commercial sector, however, there probably isn't going to be the opportunity to take that forward yet. And one of the things that sort of we've reflected on is that we in a sense, we have an action plan here, but we don't have a kind of an overarching roadmap and strategy document that sits above it. And so not all of these actions are going to be able to be delivered at once. And there is perhaps going to be naturally a sequence, and in the commercial property space, I think that's an area where there's work, for example, on retrofitting our commercial stock. We're some way off being able to sort of commence that work. There's lots and lots of other work to be done across our community assets. We're doing our leisure centres at the moment, and of course our housing stock, but we will need also to get round to the commercial assets that we own, but that's a little way off. And so one of the things that I'll be discussing within my team is about what can we do to perhaps create a sort of a clearer roadmap for people to actually understand when we can and how we're going to be able to get to some of these things.
I think that would be really valuable.
It's also worth saying that there was an intent, yes. I think it came from the Scrutiny Review Group, that there would be a pack that was given to prospective and new commercial landlords, which would give them clear ways of reducing their carbon footprint. And I don't know where we've got to with that. If we haven't progressed that might be a recommendation to Cabinet for us to completely keep the eye on that one. Missed you.
I'm going to bring in Rose here, who can update you on that.
Yeah, we got a deadline to produce that by the end of this month, and a draft has been produced. So it should be very nearly done.
That's a quick win for Scrutiny.
Would your recommendation help, or are you 90% of the way there without our recommendation?
I think it is very much in train up. Rose has been doing the drafting on this. It is going to be signed off and published reasonably soon. This certainly within the current quarter, I'd say.
Excellent. Okay, thank you. We've got a couple of hands. We've got Dick's hand up. I don't know if you have to dash off, Tom. You're beginning to look as though you're gradually moving away.
Physically, I'm keeping an eye on my messages that are coming through.
Okay, so can we take this question from Dick before you vanish? Okay, Dick, over to you.
Yeah, there is one that I would quite like to catch Tom before he goes, because it's possibly maybe more a political thing, and it relates particularly to the Zero Carbon Oxford Partnership. I was quite interested to read about that, and it's quite exciting in a way that we're actually talking about a partnership, working with a whole range of bodies, which is quite interesting. I don't know whether, Tom, it's penetrated as far as you, but I've been working for some years with some others on looking at cable cars into the city centre. Is that something you've even heard of? I mean, I've had discussions with a number of Cabinet colleagues and things over the years, and I don't really know, it's got as far as an actual serious proposal, which has been technically designed in outline and stuff like that. The point about that is that the Zero Carbon Oxford Partnership is looking at, obviously, transport issues and into the city centre. We know we have a problem with this. Cable cars, zero emission, non-polluting, equivalent of 80 buses an hour transport in from Redbridge. So I don't want to go into the particular details, but it seems to me that it's something that the Zero Carbon Oxford Partnership really ought to have on its agenda to look at. There's enough experts around, not me, who can address this. So I just wanted to flag that one up. That's something really needs political support. And that it doesn't have it, because I've never pushed for it.
I'm happy to come back on that. I mean, what I will say is that, so I live on Hilltop Road, Southfield Road is in my patch. And on April Fool's Day last year, there were a number of posters in people's windows saying that a log flume was going to be introduced onto Southfield Road, except that some people actually believed it. And they thought it was a wonderful gimmick for trying to address transportation issues. But in the same conversation that I had with them about the log flume, they talked about the cableway. So I guess the concern I've got, if I'm honest with you, is that we've met with them in the last week, the people who are proposing the plan.
Oh, have you? Oh, right.
Yeah, it's a proposal for a cableway from Redbridge all the way over to Westgate.
Yeah.
I think three things can be said. The first is that there's not a substantial business plan which we can give support to. The second thing is that in order to have people use the cableway, they would need to bring cars to the city to get to Redbridge and then go onto the cableway, which is itself problematic. The third thing is around affordability, because the latest figure I've seen is the proposal for a £4 ticket, which is not possible. I'm going to be honest with you, Dick. I think when we've got such transportation problems as we do, we don't need to divert officer time and energy away onto a cableway. I think it's not going to be a useful thing. And we spoke with Pete Sudbury, the Green cabinet member over at the county, to see whether he would give formal public support to the cableway, and he won't on behalf of the county. So I think the city itself is going to be saying no to that proposal too. We obviously wish anybody who wants to come up with new transport solutions well, and we want to hear from them when they're fully developed as business plans, so they can be affordable and actually achieve our goals. But I'm not on board with this one at this point, Dick, I'm afraid.
Okay, well, thanks. It's good to know, like, kind of where people are at, because I've had a lot of silence coming back. Actually, good to hear somebody actually saying something. A quick question, which you can also answer as well, is about in 434 in the report there. It talks about we will work with the council's citizens' assembly regarding procurement projects. I kind of thought that was sewn up and job done. So is that group of people still sort of meeting or contactable, or are they surveyed? I mean, I didn't quite understand that.
So my understanding is that we do work with some of the members, and we've got all their contact details, and when on the final day with us, they were asked if they want to stay engaged, and a number of them did. Mish, do you want to give some recent examples of the ways in which you've worked with them?
Yeah, we've done a fair amount of work with Citizens Assembly members subsequently, communicating about the types of measures that they would support, particularly around retrofit. When it comes to actually getting ordinary members of the public to take measures themselves to decarbonise, because with the best will in the world, the council's 1% of the emissions in the city, the ZCOP grouping that you were talking about is perhaps a low tens of percent, but we need widespread action across the wider population. We'll be returning to individuals who participated in the Citizens Assembly, who were literally plucked from at random. They're not activists in groups, they're just ordinary members of the public. But there was some very very eloquent and coherent thinking that came through that process, and some clear belief and support for the types of measures that ordinary people can take. So we've got a big program of communications that we're working up to seek what I would describe as behaviour change over the course of this next year, and then obviously beyond. And we will certainly want to return to some of those Citizens Assembly people to help us with that.
Thanks very much, Mish. Could we take one last question from Paula, and then I think we need to move on to recommendations. Paula, over to you.
Thank you. Yeah, it was just quickly on that as well. So is this the same assembly as 2019?
Yeah.
Yeah, and is there like scope to find new, fresh, like people to take part, just so that it is a bit more democratic?
The answer is not. We're not going to redo a citizens' assembly, and we've got an established cast of assembly members, as it were, and they are representative, and they are consulted on. They are asked to contribute to various policies that we're interested in hearing people's views on. I guess what I would say is that this is the role of a local councillor to come and share views, as you do often with us, that you hear on your doorstep, and that's how it helps to shape what the policies we come up with are. And equally, there's lots of other democratic processes people can engage with in the city council. I know there's an ambition too in the next year to have, because we've got a zero carbon council and a zero carbon city, and to have a zero carbon communities strategy rather than just a framework or action plan. And as part of that, we really do want to be making sure that we're reaching beyond, frankly speaking, the typical people who will come forward and shape environmental politics. We want to make sure that we're really reaching into underrepresented and minoritized communities.
Great, thank you.
Right, thank you very much. Can we move on to recommendations? I suppose the place to start is where we began this discussion with Linda's recommendation. Can we go from there? Do you want to formalise that now? I'm looking at Linda and at Tom. If either of you like.
I already moved it. So yeah, it's just. I mean, it's. I don't think it's that complicated. It's just to give that work strand number 47.
Are you happy to link it with what Nigel said about putting pressure on the county council to ensure it's prioritised? Are you willing to sort of accept that as well?
Yeah, but we should prioritise it, and we should put pressure on the county council to prioritise it and bring the university in as close as possible with the work to make that a central part of strategy to promote cycling.
Is it not, sorry Linda, just to be clear, the recommendation is around cycleways into the city itself. Are you focusing specifically on cycling across the whole city, which includes that? Or are you focusing on cycleways? Because as Mish was saying, there's been a fair amount of cycling infrastructure introduced using the COVID funding over the last year. I think your point is around the cycleways being lost as part of that.
I think my point would be sort of outside and inside the city. I think obviously it doesn't make sense to separate them out, does it? People need a safe, segregated route from wherever they start all the way into the city. So it should all be part of the same plan, as far as I'm concerned.
It should be. But the reason I'm particularly asking that is that obviously cycleways into and out of the city have been lost. And I think that's in part because of the internal focus on cycling infrastructure in the city.
I haven't seen any cycling infrastructure in the city, which was not segregated routes. We haven't had the segregated routes. So I mean, that's a separate issue, really, isn't it? This is about giving number 47 on this list greater priority rather than starting a whole debate over cycle tracks inside the city right now.
I think that's what I think that's a good recommendation.
That's all my recommendation was, yeah.
Okay, fine. So that's an answer to action point 47. Okay, and can you work that up into a recommendation?
I'm happy to, yes, Chair.
Are we all happy with that? Members of the committee, can I see some thumbs? Great, super.
Do you want me to go through my list of the things that I sort of thought?
I've got two from Dick potentially, but you start, Tom. Yeah, you go. You start.
So clarifying what is or is not included in net zero claims regarding indirect emissions calculations. Dick, were you happy with the response that came, or is that something that you're still wanting to press?
Yeah, I mean, it's a messy issue. It's been acknowledged. I have a disadvantage in that Rose mentioned that our carbon management plan tackles this issue of the definition of net zero. I think, though, inevitably, it's going to be used a little bit fluidly, depending which forum we're in. And so I think if I wanted a recommendation, I would like to see at the top of every paper, really, a very neat, it doesn't have to be great detail, but a neat synopsis of what is included in the measurement here of net zero. I mean, as a little example, according to some definitions of net zero, and I remember this being said when the Citizens' Assembly was meeting, the carbon emissions from the heating of our council housing stock don't feature in the calculations at all. And the reason for that, Joe Colwell said very clearly, is we don't pay the bills. So that's one definition of net zero. But actually, if you look at this report, it implies that actually we are interested in the emissions from the heating of our council housing stock. So it's little things like that, but they make vast differences. So I think my recommendation is, can we have, on the papers that are produced, maybe it could be a footnote, maybe it could be a reference to another document, but something that makes it very clear that this is the definition of net zero being used in this particular paper. And the ZCOP may have one. The City Council may choose to work with a different one. I don't mind. I think there's going to be loads of different definitions, but if we just think that net zero means one thing, it's going to cause a lot of confusion, because people will just say, yeah, but that's not included, or that is included, or so does that make it clear? It's really, I'd like it at the heading, takes me back to O-level physics. Define your terms at the beginning, and then your method, and then your experiment, sort of thing. You just put it in there. It's just standard practice. And because it's so messy, I think it would be helpful to be very clear. So it's a very simple recommendation, really. Definition, please, at the top. What's included, what isn't.
Okay, it's the first of your recommendations. I've got another one down too that you made or you proposed. Are we happy with that first recommendation that net zero should be defined?
Sorry, just to be clear here, that net zero has been defined in that cabinet paper in December. I think what Dick is asking for is an expression of it, so that people can more easily understand what the references in the paper are.
Exactly. Whenever they come across a paper, it took me quite a long time to actually find. Well, I actually followed up the links that you put, Tom, in your report, which were very helpful. Took me to the ZCOP papers. I had to rummage around those a little bit to find out what definitions they were working with.
Okay, fine. I think we're happy with that recommendation.
But there's no single definition, Liz. So it's about any particular paper needs to say what they're working with.
Okay, fine. And there's a second proposal that you've made. I've got one version of it. That the 8 or 9 diversity action points about biodiversity should be in the officer's job description. I gather we've now got Tristan Carlisle. That seems to me to be a useful recommendation, unless it's already in his job description. We don't know.
Which is fine. Well, let's recommend it. And then without
sorry,
any effort at all, they can say it's been done.
Chair, but with respect, I can't change a member of staff's job description. I just can't do that.
And we've already
he's already employed on a. I can't. That can't be done. What I can do, as I suggested, is bring back some of the additional recommendations that were in the Scrutiny review report around biodiversity that haven't been picked up in this action plan, so that they can be considered for future action. But I can't rewrite someone's job description. I'm sorry.
No, that's fair enough. I'm sorry, I hadn't picked that up when you mentioned it earlier. Right, so we don't need a recommendation there, because that's something that you're doing already. Okay.
If it's any help, Liz, I can quite easily share. I've produced this wondrous spreadsheet which cross-references the progress report we got here and the recommendations from the emergency panel, climate emergency panel. I can send that through to Mish or anybody actually for that matter, or members of the committee.
I think it goes,
and then people can actually just cross-correlate between the two. There may be some mistakes. I had to do it in some haste, but it is a quite useful cross-reference. Then you can see, and the things that I think don't seem to have been specifically adopted or not yet addressed or something, show in red, so you can see immediately what doesn't, where there isn't.
You've kindly shown it to me, and I think it's a really useful document. So I think if all the committee members and Tom, Mish, and Rose could have it as well, I think that would be very useful. I can see hands up. Are these recommendations or comments on? Fine. Shall we start with you, Marie? Because I'm aware you have to vanish at 7:10. So it's getting near the witching hour, isn't it? Okay.
It is indeed. I can hear noises next door. And yeah, I'd like a recommendation around, I suppose, a greater effort to ensure that climate policies are disability inclusive, and that at the earliest possible stage, when these policies and strategies are being developed, disabled people are involved in at the design stage. We're tight on time, but I'm happy to provide other wording, but I think it would be useful to have something really clear and strong on that, and reflecting the recent research and also recommendations that the UN have made in this area, and also reminding ourselves of our public sector equality duties and various other duties under the Equality Act.
Right.
Can I ask, is there an additional thing here, Marie, which is, I think this report is not unique for having an equalities impact assessment which doesn't reflect the true situation. And I wonder whether, as well as that, there might be a reconsideration about how these assessments are done.
I think that's, you know, I've made this point in other contexts before, but I think that's absolutely the case. But I think it's not just about the impact assessment. To be fair, you want your impact assessment to say what your impact assessment currently says, but for that to actually be an accurate representation of the situation. Because if you'd gone through the stages, and if in, you know, not you personally, sorry, if one had gone through the stages of ensuring that the impact was properly assessed at the earliest possible point, those policies and strategies would thoroughly work to mitigate these issues and ensure that climate action actually was designed to be inclusive, fully inclusive of disabled people. So that's the first point. So yes, that's important, but actually it's really about the brass tacks of the detail and the detail of how these things in practice impact certain groups. I won't give examples because we're so short of time, but I'm happy to give some outside of this meeting. But the other point is, which was slightly missed by your very helpful response, both from you and Mish, was that actually there is something here about cumulative impact. So your response, you said, well, this is a general report giving an overview, but that's exactly the space that I would want to see an understanding of how different policies combine together in their impact, you know, ZEZ plus LTNs in terms of the way that their exemptions are working or not. For example, I mean, I'm simplifying, overly simplifying, but actually it's really important to understand how these things impact collectively. And so that should also be reflected in the recommendation. But I think, yes, great to improve the impact assessments, but actually if this stuff happens early on enough, that should become more redundant anyway.
So do the members agree that?
Yeah, can I just be a bit cheeky, Lynn? Just add that, you know, one of the impacts is reducing the heating bills of council tenants. Is an equalities impact as well that could be included.
I think that's a separate recommendation, isn't it? I think that would be separate. Not that we can't have a separate recommendation, but let's just look at Marie's first. Climate policies being disability inclusive. Are the members of the committee happy with that? And can I pass that on to Tom and Marie to sort out the wording between themselves? Is everybody happy with that? Anybody unhappy is probably the easiest way with a tiny screen like this. No, everybody silent. Right. Nigel, I don't know if you want to make a comment or a recommendation.
I'd like to make a recommendation, and this is a sort of particular bugbear of mine, so I'm going to put it on the table, and I've got some words. I mean, I accept it can't be done for this report, but in future updates, I would like greater clarity as to how far the resources allocated enable us to meet the goals in the individual actions. So to give you an example, we have a goal of 95% of our housing stock having a certain EPC level, which is very ambitious. We've got 8,000 council houses. So a lot of council houses to get to that point. Some may be there already, some may not. We have, you know, bid for funds, fine. We've got some green shoots, fine. But I've got no feel whether the funds allocated, even in the MTF, are going to be enough to enable us to meet that sort of target. They'll definitely take us on the journey, but I just want a bit of help when we have an update as to whether, you know, it's going to get 30% of the way there, 50% of the way there. Just don't know. An report doesn't make it clear. And I think people have got a right to know that sort of thing. It's about managing expectations and being honest in the end, because it may be that we just don't have enough money to do it all, in which case, because government won't give it to us, and we should say so. But I just think we have to be open about the facts. And I think, you know, if I was a more or less producer, Mish, my friend Mish, I'd send you a paragraph about that straight to them and say, help me with this, would you? Because I wouldn't know really the answer to the question I've just tabled. So
can I ask, just for clarification, because there's two potential bits to what you're saying there. The first is, I want to know what the return to investment is. So for X amount of money, this is what we achieve. But then there's a second bit, which is, okay, you've said that you want 95% of council homes achieving EPCC. What percentage are you going to achieve by what year? So what are you trying to get at here? Return to investment or tracking progress?
No, it's the second point, Tom.
Tracking progress.
Right. I'm assuming that there will be quality of investment, and it'll be well priced and efficient, and because you're working up all these packages, I'm taking that as read, right? What I'm interested in is how far on the journey are we going to get, by when, and how far does £8 million in the 22-23 MTFP budget, to give an example, take us on that journey? And I think that's what we want to know.
I think we can definitely reflect that in future updates. Yeah, but what I'd also say is that we do each year produce a carbon management audit, which basically says exactly what we've decarbonised, by how much, and what the expectation is to get us towards the rest of the journey is. And that's something which is very much science-led. It's something which is contributed to by the chief scientist, Nick Eyre. Similarly, we've done the same for Zero Carbon Oxford Partnership. So I do want to reassure the committee that while it's not captured discreetly in this report, it is available for consumption.
Yeah, but some headlines about the relationship between the investment and its deliverables and how far it's getting us to the targets that we've set ourselves, good targets, ambitious targets. I think we just need a bit of clarity about that. That's all I'm asking for. I don't think it takes a lot of work. So you've got it, you say you've got it somewhere else. You just need to put some lines in here, really.
Yeah.
So the recommendation that we've got, in your words, Nigel, is in future updates, greater clarity about the resources that we've got to enable us how to meet the actions that we wish to perform.
Yeah, how far the resources we have allocated will enable us to meet the actions that we have.
Okay, fine. Is that going to be in the route map that you've mentioned, Mish, or would that not have funding details in it?
No, I think in a sense it probably would help address that point. I think picking that specific reality, the short answer is that we've got the 8 million that you've identified in the HRA, which covers the next sort of period. We don't know how much funds we will get from government, so it would be difficult for us to sort of put a very accurate sort of plan together for the rate of the retrofitting of council housing. But I think we could say what we think that the £8 million would achieve. So yes, we can project our kind of level of resourcing that we would need to be able to deliver. So I think we can put some more intelligent stuff around this, but in some of these areas that is yet to be worked up.
Yeah, no, that's fair enough. But here we've got very specific numbers, very specific cash amounts, and therefore you've done the work. You know how far this will take you. So I just think we need to be just open about it, really.
So we've got this recommendation. Do we have the agreement of the members here that recommendation should go forward?
It's a great recommendation. Thanks, Nigel.
Good, great. Everybody happy? Any more recommendations? Have I missed any? I don't think I've got any. Tom?
No, I was just saying that I think you'd got all of them. So
okay, lovely, great. I know that I stopped Dick off sort of mid-sentence, and I apologise for that. If you had a recommendation you want to make, Dick, then please make it now.
No, it's all right. I was just thanking Nigel for making that recommendation, and the point about the equalities thing is a sort of more general one, because I had the same feeling, but in a different sort of way. When I looked at the equalities statement, I thought, well, that's a bit of a copy and paste job. There's actually a lot of equalities implications in these plans, all sorts of different ones, and it'd be quite nice to have a bit more thorough look at what the implications are. But I mean, that could be a recommendation if people want to put it in.
Well, I think it's covered by. I thought it was covered by what Marie had said, really. To be honest.
Yes, I think so. Marie's Marie had to leave, but
Yeah.
I think it's.
I mean, you see, when I was thinking about the equalities, I was very conscious that a lot of what we're talking about is reducing council tenants' heating bills drastically, and maybe even charging them extra because of we're doing that, you know. But I mean, it's a fantastic possibility for levelling up, especially with what's happening with energy prices, and are likely to continue if Vladimir Putin starts to hold us to ransom. So, you know, it's got potentially big implications, I think.
Yeah. Well, thanks very much, and thank you very much. I think.
Liz, can I just say one thing? I'm going to be very cheeky here. Following on what Paula has said about the Citizens' Assembly, the discussion we had around needing to have these decisions being democratic, open, accessible, shaped by people. I'm conscious that the City Council held a Citizens' Assembly which transformed how we did things. With the new administration at the County Council, I wonder whether the Scrutiny Committee might think it valuable for that council to hold a similar Citizens' Assembly. I'm just going to offer that up.
Oh, I've got to laugh. I quite like that idea. It's got a certain impishness about it.
Would you like me to ask? I will ask. Okay. I will take that away as an action point from the meeting. Fine. Great.
Liz, I was suggesting that it might be something you want to recommend rather than something you directly take up with the administration.
I'm not sure that we can make a recommendation to the County Council.
We do all the time in full council.
I'll be guided by Tom, but I don't think a recommendation from the Scrutiny can go.
Technically possible to do so, but obviously they're under no obligation at all to pay any sort of to put any weight on it. So I mean, it's completely up to you if you want to ask a different organisation to do something. They may listen, they may not. I couldn't guess.
You could, of course, ask the leader to make representations to her equivalent at the county.
We could indeed. I think at the moment, can I just take that away, Tom? I wasn't expecting that kind of left field thing.
I'm gonna leave to my next meeting or else, because you've got lots of nods from your members in the room that they like that suggestion. So, in the spirit of openness and inclusion, I don't know if you want to put it to them. Thank you for your time, and I will see you all soon. Bye.
Thank you very much for your time, and also thank you very much both to Rose and to Mish. You're welcome to stay if you don't have a busy evening otherwise, and you're also very welcome to leave if you've got supper or something happening. Okay.
Thank you. Bye.
Good night.
Before we lose too many officers, Liz, can I just check the spelling? I understand we've got Tristan Carlisle now as our ecologist and biodiversity manager. How's Carlisle spelt, please?
It's like the city. It's Carlisle, and it's Tristan as in Lancelot. Okay, right. So if we can move back to the beginning now, with those of us who are left. Okay, we need to go back to apologies for absence, and Alice. I don't think we have any apologies, but can you fill us in?
Yeah, that's right. No apologies for absence. Just Councillor Tidball letting us know that she would have to drop off and she'd rejoin again if we were still going. Okay, fine. And we had a declaration of interest earlier on from Linda. Any other declarations of interest? You can, of course, make one during the course of our discussions if it comes up. Any now? No? Okay, fine. Chair's announcements we've done. We're on to minutes, item 4 minutes. I hope that we can agree these as an accurate record. Does anybody think differently? There was just one little phrase, if I might. I mean, I don't know how important it is, but there's a line in here which talks about projections of the age profile of the city's residents were taken into account in preparing the local plan. Yeah. I think it's about the future housing requirements in the local plan. I can send the reference through if Tom wants it. Where is this? Sorry. Oh, it's paragraph 71 of the annual monitoring report, infrastructure funding statement. About halfway down the page, set page 8. Projections of the age profile. Oh yes, I found it. Yeah. If you send that to Tom, that's useful, and that can be added as a footnote, I think. Just a clarification. I think it's about, what are the future's housing needs given the age profile, really. Okay, fine. Yes, are you happy with that, Tom? Yep, absolutely, that's fine.
Lovely. Okay, fine. Work plan and forward plan. Over to you, Tom.
Yes, so a couple of things just to mention. First off, February, on what I had down as the proposed work plan, it includes the Oxfordshire Plan 2050. I heard today, and I have very little information about it, but I did hear today that that might be delayed. I don't know when until, so just to sort of be aware. And then what I had for March in the papers was the Equalities, Diversity and Inclusion Strategy, Food Strategy and Safeguarding Update. But chatting with Chair, we decided that actually it might be better, given that the Safeguarding Update is a backwards looking report, and therefore it is just a review of the year, and so it's not time sensitive. If we put that further to April, and instead had the report on the business plan, the development of the business plan for next year instead. Would you support that?
I think that would be a good way forward. Can I just mention Oxfordshire Plan 2050? I was really concerned when we were advised that effectively we were too late to make any recommendations at Reg 18 stage. And I imagine that we're all equally concerned that we should have an opportunity to make recommendations at the Reg 19 stage. I don't want it to go through without our having that opportunity. So I've asked Tom if he can stay on the case and make sure we know when the districts are coming forward with their scrutiny meetings and when we'll have ours, so they can all be dovetailed and our recommendations can be properly included. I don't think we've had any feedback on the points that we made to Councillor Hollingsworth and Adrian Arnold, have we?
No. So next time that they come back, we can ask them what they did with the previous set of recommendations.
Yes, I think we should ask them. I think that's important. Thank you. Right. Okay, fine. Are we okay on those proposals by Tom about moving things forwards and backwards between March and April? April will be in purdah for the elections, but what Tom suggests circumvents that because we can still hear those items during April. They won't be political. Is that okay? Great, lots of thumbs, good. Right, okay, so we're confirming agreement to the current priorities with those changes. So now, I'm very pleased to say we're moving on to procurement update, and Annette Osborne has been waiting extremely patiently, and I don't suppose it's been a bundle of laughs for the last hour and a half, but we're very pleased to have you here. You are going to explain, well, you're going to present your report, but really this is an opportunity for you to explain the plan changes so that we can understand what kind of input we might be asked to make in order to improve the amendments that you're proposing to come forward. So over to you, Annette.
Okay, so this was just my opportunity to sort of put out the current procurement strategy, which was a 2-year strategy put in place in September 2020, just before I started with the council. So it was built on me not understanding fully what was going on in the council and the procurement team before picking up on different factors. So now I've been working within procurement at the council for a year. It's clear that there's a lot of areas that I think we need to focus and change within the strategy. The difficulty that I had last time was that we cross over pretty much every area of the council. So this proposal has gone out to all the service areas and the council entities, so Oxford Direct Services and Oxford City Housing, to ask for their input. That then becomes quite difficult managing input from all of those different areas. But it's important that I listen and see where I can dovetail the procurement strategy to meet various other strategies within the council. So at a first glance, I proposed within a document proposed amendments that I feel that I want to make to bring us probably a bit more up to date and on board. Social value being a massive one. There is TOMS, national TOMS, which TOMS is themes, outcomes and measures. But I've done quite a bit of research into that, and various other councils have created their own version of TOMS, but it's more related to the local area, and I feel that's really important for us at Oxford City. So it's taking the national measures but making them better for us. So perhaps being able to give higher scores where the social value is going to directly impact in Oxford and bring money back into the city. Obviously, we can't discount if it's a national company and they are doing quite a bit around social value, but obviously they would get a lower score if it's not a direct impact into the council. So I think that's sort of one of the first points that I want to bring in, and we've already started working on that model now. Earlier on, I know we talked about zero carbon and how that can fit in. So there's an area that I want to do within there in terms of how we can measure activities from our suppliers. That's quite a big challenge. We've got over 500 contracts, so it's going to be physically impossible to do it across all contracts. It might be that we'll look to target the larger contracts that we've got, particularly around the construction, when we're doing a lot around that aspect, and that's a big focus on social value as well, apprenticeships and learning and working with schools and colleges and all around that area. We're looking at the environmental impact assessment. We don't have that in strategy now, so I want to bring that in. GDPR is touched on with our contracts, but I think we need to strengthen that, and I've already started conversations with our GDPR officer to see how we can bring that into the strategy. We are going to have transforming public procurement coming in. The original consultation that government did around it has been passed with a few minor changes. So, and whatever I do within the strategy, I need to start accounting for how we're going to handle the requirements that we're going to need to deal with. Some of them will be mandated, some of it will be best practice. Contract management needs strengthening within the organisation, so I really want to start honing in onto there's a contract management wheel. There's some tools that we can bring into the strategy which will help all the service areas. I've been doing some work with Simon Grove White on inclusive economy and working really how can we work better with our local suppliers, with BCSEs. Can we, and I picked up on one this week, just a typical example where they're looking to put in maybe a mobile cafe into Redbridge now that we're putting the super hub in there. So I've already picked that one up and said, can we have a conversation with Simon? Can we engage locally? Is there anybody locally that we can do this with rather than, going out into the national market? We have to be guided by regulations, so it depends on the values, but there's certainly stuff under 189,000 that we could look locally to do. The Nolan principles aren't in the strategy, and I think that's really important that we do pick up on that, and also some principles around good governance. How can we consider how value for money can be aligned with ethical standards? We've got the supplier spend charts in the last one, so I want to really sort of update those. and social value outcomes that we've achieved so far. But at the moment, they're in the middle of the strategy. And I kind of want to take them out of the strategy and put them at the end so that the information is there and you can see what's going on. But I'd like the strategy to flow a bit more. I also want to have a look at this small to medium enterprise reporting that we do. So we report on the direct spend that we can see. What we don't do is look at any indirect spend that's going on. So where we're dealing with some of these big contractors, are they spending locally, and can we look at that data and can we start to capture that so that we can see a bit more holistically what we're doing as a council? So it's quite a big ask that I'm looking to put in, but I wanted this opportunity to open it up to yourselves to see, before we start formulating this and before it starts going for approval, whether there is anything here that you feel that I've missed or I'm missing the opportunity on that you'd like me to consider.
Thank you very much, Annette. It seems to me that you've taken on a huge job in all sorts of different directions. There's your report and also the amendments that you're suggesting. So I'm going to ask the members if they have questions or comments, either on the report or on the amendments. Starting with Linda, we have a lot of hands. Linda, then Dick, then Chris, then Imogen, then Paula, then Nigel. I'm losing your names, there are so many of you. Okay, so if we can start in that order. Thank you very much. Linda.
Thank you, Annette. I just wanted to make sure on the social value submitted by suppliers table, I just wanted to make sure that we're not being too prescriptive there. What comes to my mind, as I said, I declared an interest at the start, trustee of Raw Workshop in Blackbird Leys, which provides placements to people from a wide variety of backgrounds, whether that's like ex-offenders, ex-addicts, right through to kids excluded from school or people from learning disabilities. There's all sorts of different programs. Would that all be picked up when in the table it talks about mentoring, placements and apprenticeships, it describes some of those, but obviously it's not exhaustive. But I just wanted to make sure that it wasn't exclusive in what it's describing. Thank you.
Do you want me to answer that one before we move to the next? Yes, okay. No, it won't be. I think what we're going to do at the moment is we're going to follow the lines of previous ones where we've had responses that have come back in. There are some that are specific and some that are quite generic. It will be picking up the suppliers that have said that they're committing to it at this stage, and what it is that they are committing to. So it's probably more of a high level. So it might be sort of working with schools and colleges. It might be mentoring. It might be apprenticeships. To get the actual physical detail in it, and the background is where the contract management comes into it, and that's what we're falling down on at the moment. So I can only pick up the responses that we've had from tenders that the procurement team have been involved with. The plan with bringing in OXTOMs is that we then move into more of the measures. We then get more specific. We then start to challenge more around you committed to this, what have you delivered, and how's that impacted on the local economy? Does that answer your question? Or
I think so. So it's more a description of like what we're doing at the moment rather than a prescription for the future.
Yes.
But yeah, I would just hope that in terms of when we're looking at designing a policy for the future, as I said, it's not prescriptive and open to new ideas of the organisations we're working with, saying this is what we feel is needed in the community and this is what we'd like to provide in response to that, and that we could respond to that positively. Thanks.
Absolutely. I don't want to restrict us at all, because there's a lot of good ideas out there. So I think some of the ones that we've got on OXTOMs at the moment are other, which is suggestions that anybody can make to us.
Are you saying, Annette, that we don't really need a recommendation because this will be covered by the new TOMs that you're going to introduce?
Yes.
Okay. Right. Are you happy with that, Linda? Or would you like a recommendation? No? Okay, fine. Well, you can always come back later on. Chris, your question.
Thank you. I wanted to particularly focus on when you got the 5% weighting that is given to social value considerations. That has the potential to do a lot of good, and it's also possible that because it's a 5% weighting that it might always end up outweighed by other factors, and in practice not moving things around as much as we might like. So what I'd like to ask about in particular, and there might be a recommendation on the back of this, would be reporting and monitoring relating to that. So two metrics that spring to mind, but I'm sure we can think of better ones, would be how often does the bidder who provides the best score on the social value front end up being the winning bidder? Or for example, how often does taking into account that 5% social value weighting change the outcome? How often does that cause you to change from what would have been the most preferred bidder to somebody else becoming the most preferred bidder? I'm sure there are better ways to measure that, but those are just intended as a couple of example metrics, which would be really great to have reported, perhaps as part of the annual monitoring report, perhaps as a better venue for it.
Would you like to comment on that, Annette? Introducing
yeah, I think that's going to be quite a bit of work, and I'm going to have to get my head around how we could do that. The reason being is that we operate with a devolved procurement, so not everything comes through the team. So anything that comes through the team, I can have a look at the responses and we can maybe look at that. I'm going to have to think about how we can do it as a wider remit. The other thing is that we have moved that percentage to 10% already. So 10% is now in for social value.
So if this is a take it away and consider it in more detail, could I suggest a recommendation along the lines of monitoring and reporting regarding the impact of considering social value, and perhaps we can phrase that a little bit better, and then we can get a written response on how that can or can't be pursued.
Okay, shall we hold that for the moment, and then we'll come back to the recommendations at the end, Chris? Is that okay? Right.
Sounds good.
Imogen.
I'll actually make a point off the back of what Chris was saying. I'm glad it's moved up to 10%. I was going to ask how that 5% social value consideration weighting compares to other councils. I think there was also reference in the report to it being lower in some cases and higher in others, where applicable, which does make sense because the value of that is very different if you're buying furniture for council as opposed to if you're carrying out building works. There are very different contexts, but I did want maybe a little more clarity on when it would be and what sort of percentage you might move up to and when that might happen and when that requirement might be decreased, like what are the exceptional circumstances essentially. And also on that, I suppose on that, the social value weighting, how would you, for example, weigh up the positive and the negative environmental impacts, say, of those bidding for a contract? So my thoughts are, if you had questions that were focused on positives rather than negatives, you might get a skewed response. So, for example, you could have a huge polluter, and if the question is, what have you done to support environmental charities? And they can say, we gave this amount of money to this environmental charity. You might not necessarily see how that might be outweighed by some of the huge negatives that polluter has contributed to. So I was wondering how the weighting works there and how carefully it's scrutinized. And yeah, how environmental harm and other kinds of social value harm are kind of weighed up. Thanks.
So in terms of environmental impacts, it's a good point, and we do want to sort of strengthen what we're doing on that side at the moment. There's a very, very, I think, loose question in request for quotation documents, which is sort of like the lower value aspect of what we do. When we get into the higher value, then we work on environmental impact questions, the sustainability side, with the stakeholders that we're working with, and each different tender will have a different set of questions dependent on what we're doing, what services we're buying in, or what products we're buying. So it's really difficult for me to sit here and say there's always 1, 2, 3, these 3 questions are always asked. It very much depends on what it is that we're buying, what's important to the service area. Is it, you know, is it local? Is it further afield? What I can probably do for you, if it will help and we can take it away as an action, is to come back to you with maybe from the last 5 large tenders that we've done, what environmental questions have we asked? How did it impact on the outcome of the tender award?
That would be really helpful, thank you.
Okay.
That's really useful. When you've seen that, Imogen, do you want to make some kind of an email report back to the rest of the committee?
Yeah, I was, because if there is a recommendation off the back of it, it would come in late. So I was kind of playing with that one in my head. But I suppose if I'm unhappy with that process, would it be okay for me to, would the committee be supportive of a general recommendation to improve it?
I can't tell, but the thing that I can say at the moment is that we'll be coming back with recommendations at our next meeting, which is the 1st of February. It's a very short time away, and we can either just agree the recommendations that arise out of this evening, or we can add another 1 or 2 recommendations, one of which might be one that arises from the work that Annette's going to send you. So,
yeah, perfect. Yeah.
So we're still open to recommendations on the 1st of February. Okay, does that make sense to you as well, Annette? It means that you're going to have to get this stuff to Imogen fairly quickly, so it's another pressure on your life.
I'll do my best to do that. And in terms of responses, I'm asking for response back on the strategy from the service areas by the 1st of April. So I've actually given everybody quite a long time, so we do have some space in here time-wise.
Excellent. It's a very rare thing to hear, so okay, you have lots of free time. Right. Shall we move on to Paula at this point?
Thank you. Yeah, so thanks, Annette, for the report and the proposed amendments. I was just happy to see that you were thinking of adding local priorities into the amended thing, because I noticed that there wasn't much attention to that in the original, and to kind of, the saying goes to think global, act local, and that's really important, and that can really benefit the climate as well, so that would draw in a lot around that. I was just thinking, there were a few things I had questions on, just around, I know that there were some companies called the Eastern Shires Purchasing Organisation and Yorkshire Purchasing Organisation. I just wanted to know what, is that supplier that we're dealing with at the moment, because they're quite further afield than Oxford, and I've got a few other questions as well around the focus with key institutions in Oxford, how often are there conversations with not just universities, who I think are key to this because they do a lot of outsourcing, and I used to work at OUP, and they do work with suppliers in India and the Philippines, and it's kind of, I'm sure the university is very similar, and trying to get more not just the council investing locally, but also those key institutions, because there's also community hubs like Flows who do a lot of things in the local area, and all of their suppliers are local. So I'm just wondering how all of that will fit in together. Sorry, I've got quite a lot but there's two more. The second was there was a bit around in the original report to target and encourage BAME and women-led subject matter experts to come to meet the buyer events, and I just wanted to know how the council would go about doing this. And then finally, I noticed the Oxford living wage for the the OCC and ODSL scored a 0 in the table, and I just wondered if you could talk a bit about that. But yeah, sorry, I've thrown a lot at you, so I'll stop there.
Okay, so if I start with the first one, so ESPO, WIPO, CCS, Crown Commercial Services, they are all buying organisations. So they are organisations that have been formed. So Crown Commercial is a Cabinet Office or central government buying on behalf of central government or putting in frameworks for organisations to use. And we do use some of their frameworks. In some cases, it's a quicker route to market. And what the buying organisations have done is they've aggregated spend to hopefully drive better pricing. Doesn't always work out that way, but sometimes it does work out that we get better pricing, better quality goods, services, etc. Through that whole aggregation of spend. But there are a lot of buying organisations out there, and they don't always tick the boxes for what we want. So when we review a procurement, we look at the procurement strategy, the route to market that we're going to take. Is it going to be a framework? Are we going to do what we call a request for quotation exercise because the value is not too high? Or are we going to actually do an FTS tender, which is the replacement for OJU? So they form part of our consideration. And although they're not local, it doesn't mean to say that the suppliers that have been awarded contracts that they're managing aren't local, so they could have a local supplier on there. In terms of working with the universities and other councils, we're trying to do more work with the universities. I've had some conversations with Oxfordshire County Council to see how we could perhaps work better together. Particularly when we're going out for the same sort of products or services, what can we do? But that's, I think it's quite hard because County Council have just gone through a whole restructure in their procurement team following the challenge that they had in, so that's all been restructured. South and Vale have interims in place. West Oxfordshire, they have their buying done elsewhere. So it's actually quite difficult, and Cherwell's obviously coming under county now. So it's quite difficult to sort of start to build those relationships, but we're trying. Meet the Buyer event didn't happen last year, obviously with COVID, that got a bit difficult. So it's going to be on the cards in the next strategy, and then we'll work through how we think we can involve everybody from the wider community. And I'm always open for ideas as to how I might be able to do that, so I might come and ask you for ideas on that front. The Oxford living wage, sorry Paula, what was the question on the Oxford living wage?
Yeah, it was just that in the table OCC and ODSL scored 0, and I just wanted to know like a bit more information around that. Why?
Okay. That was a really old, that was in the last strategy. Yeah, I can't answer that question. I mean, I think you'll find now that so my team do most of the buying for OCHL, so we do make sure that that goes into all of the contracts that we put in place for them. And an ODSL, I know, do follow the principle of putting the Oxford Living Wage or the Living Wage Foundation, the National Living Wage Foundation rate into their contracts.
Great, thank you, Annette.
Right, thank you. Nigel, could we have your question, comment, please?
Yeah, I'll be as quick as I can, Liz. Just a couple of things. I think you've got a bit of confusion in your document about zero carbon city and zero carbon council and the dates. I mean, you've got a typo talking about 2020 at one point as a target time. I think we passed that by a couple of years ago. So you might want to look at that. I suppose I've got two, and also this is the table, before I come to a couple of bigger thoughts, where you list these contracts. I didn't quite understand what we were measuring there. Can we be a bit clear about that? So are we measuring when a contract has met a particular aspiration or area of social value. I think that's what it means, but it's not clear to me when we break I think it's 4.3.4, I think, is the table from memory. You might just want to explain better what we're actually measuring there.
I can probably tell you, Councillor Chapman, that's coming out. This was one of the tables that was put in before I was on board, and it wasn't clear. My understanding is not what has been delivered, but what was committed to.
Yeah, well, that comes back then to the language of the report. And so, for instance, going back to the Oxford Living Wage, we talk about those who win or who tender for contracts having a commitment to the Oxford Living Wage. I don't understand what that means, to be honest with you, if I'm being brutal. I want to guarantee they're paying it. And I also want some external evidence that they are. Because, you know, a company can put in a tender document, I'm going to do all sorts of things. Sorry, there's a bit of noise in the background here, not of my making. But, you know, they can make all sorts of commitments, but we'd have to know they actually have done it. And so I think that's a bit weak. The language is weak, and I think it needs to be beefed up, both on the living wage, but also the living wage foundation area. And the third area for me, which I found confusing, is on your equalities in procurement paragraph number 6. I mean, you talk about the Equalities Act and saying kind of we're not discriminating against people. Well, of course we're not. I mean, you know, heavens above, we can't under the law do that, right? But the real issue for me is how far in social value we then weight within social value the benefits that accrue to the most disadvantaged groups in the city. There's another layer below the general social value observation, so 10%, but then how do you weight within the 10%? Let's say an SME comes forward and says, from say Blackbird Leys, the raw example could well be a good one. I want to, you know, bid for this. Another company from another part of the city where there is not the same level of disadvantage comes forward to bid for it. Do we give greater weight on social value to the raw example than to somebody else? Because the raw example by implication will benefit disabled people, it might benefit people who've been in prison or whatever disadvantaged group we particularly want to meet. So I think there's a bit more subtlety and sophistication required here than just a sort of rather high level social value observation. And for me, to be honest, pin my colours to the mast, I would like us to weight the scores we give companies where disadvantaged groups benefit in their workforce or in their community. I'd like to have them to have a higher score than other people coming along with so-called social value thoughts and ideas, because we particularly want to trickle wealth down as best we can to those parts of the city which are most disadvantaged. That's part of our big strategy. So I'd like us to be quite upfront about it. Now, I don't know whether we're allowed to do it legally. That's a different question. But I know politically, I'd very much like us to do that, because I think that's part of our way of improving the lives of the most disadvantaged citizens who live here.
We will be able to do it. That's the whole point of bringing in OXTOMS, because OXTOMS has the measures, and those measures can be specific for organisations that are helping to get disadvantaged people back into the workplace, whether they are ex-offenders or whether they are NEETs or any of that. So there's a different scoring metric for various different things, and all we're doing with that at the moment is making it more local to give us a bit of a higher score when it's the impact locally rather than it being the national TOMS. So that's what I'm planning on bringing into the next strategy.
And so just if I could just pursue this one. So let us say in a part of Oxford, a ward in Oxford, you've got a high ethnic minority population, and they are struggling for all the reasons we know sometimes to get meaningful and good work. If a company is set up there and works to provide opportunity work for those people, because they're a targeted group, a minority who we want to make a special effort to improve the quality of life of, can we also give greater weight to that sort of thing, as well as those NEET things? I know what a NEET is, don't worry. With NACRO, right? I see that, but what about these other more issues around race and also around gender too? I mean, there are lots of different groups under the Minorities Act who are disadvantaged economically, who we'd like to see have a better quality of life in this city. So I'm just wondering whether we can really be quite sophisticated about that.
We can certainly build in questions, and we can certainly point suppliers in a direction, which we've recently done on the sustainable housing framework that we put in place. It is about being honest, it is about being open, it is about being upfront. And if we state that we are following the TOMS metrics, of which a lot of that is in, then that's quite clear to certainly those suppliers that are used to tendering the kind of scoring that we're going to do.
Yeah, that's an assurance that it'll be weighted accordingly, which is what we want, isn't it, in the end?
Yeah.
Okay, that's very helpful. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Annette. Right, a question from you, Hosni.
Thank you very much for the report and for bearing with us. And it's really nice to see works such as like Claire's has been, you're looking at a wide range of what's going on nationally and how we can incorporate some of those into our work in Oxford, which is really great to see. I do wonder whether, like, looking at some of that kind of community wealth building angle, whether in our broader economic strategy, I know this might be a bigger question, as in outside of the scope of this report, how the anchor institutions can be encouraged to also, I think what would be really actually transformative was if all the anchor institutions in the city did the same, basically. Unfortunately, obviously, we don't have that much power necessarily. We have some soft power and we have some, at times, some harder power, but we don't have an awful lot of power over those institutions. But it would be great to look for opportunities where that interaction with the anchor institutions could happen, such that these procurement, because really that's what we're looking at, isn't it? Getting the other anchor institutions to really engage with this. Just your thoughts on that. And then on the other point that some have already made, actually. So, for example, I don't know whether you're all aware, but it was in the press not that long ago. The Science Museum actually has BP as one of its sponsors, this is, I think, the problem is that big corporations are often very, very good at hiding their dirty work. And I mean that literally. They are very good at doing charitable things. But yet, if you look at like where they're putting their money, whether it's fossil fuels, whether it's places where there are terrible wars going on and terrible oppression going on, there's lots and lots of examples of this. So I would like us to specify, I know we have an ethical policy that includes, Tom has already sent me that on a previous occasion, that includes some of that, but it'd be good if that's also, when we talk about zero carbon, climate change is about climate justice. And if we are putting money into places that are then investing in fossil fuels, in places where people are being displaced, in places where people are, governments are engaging in acts of war, aggression and or oppression, it's really important that we are making that very clear that that's not, I know that there is already a background that might not be necessary to be added now to this policy because there is a greater, so I don't know, I just wanted to ask whether that is already in there. Any opportunities that we can make the anchor institutions kind of bite. And I agree with what Nigel also mentioned about the percentages and what value, what we need to somehow make it more meaty as well, the implications, because we don't have, because of the fact that we only a small percentage of the city's buying power.
I can answer the question on the anchor institutions because there's a couple of officers, Simon Grove White and Clayton Llewellyn, who are working on bringing groups together. I've sat in on a couple of workshops where we have had the university, we've had Thames Valley Police, we've had County Council there, we've had talks coming in from, for instance, RAW and people like that, to try and work out how we can all work better together and how we can all support local together. So there is a big emphasis on that from the council. There is only so much that procurement can do when we're not involved in everything. But that's why I'm keen to, to get the strategy out to all service areas to have a look at what they're putting in their strategies and see where it's feasible, where it's practical, where it's possible. I can bring it in.
Yeah, every opportunity. And I know it's just often the different departments working together in a more, but it's difficult, I know.
Do you have a comment, Annette, about BP or indeed other organisations which might be said to be greenwashing?
It's actually quite a difficult one, because to do the full supply chain management, which is what we're looking at, to delve in deeper to some of these big organisations and see what's happening, takes an awful amount of time to do, which as a small council we probably can't go to those levels at the moment. If we do get press about organisations, if we do hear anything, then we are very much aware of it. The team do discuss it. We discuss it with service areas as well. But that's probably as far as we go on that route at the moment. Okay, thank you.
Could I just comment in passing that investment is one of the scope 3 carbon emissions measures, when it can be one of them, which is quite interesting. And I think if I read right, in the Zero Carbon Oxford partnership, they've kept investment in the scope 3 emissions metrics, but I'm not sure about that. But it's interesting that investments do actually count when you're counting carbon emissions under some measures.
Right. Okay, thanks. I wonder what we can do with that information, Dick, because that's quite important. Could you work that up and then circulate it to us?
I don't think realistically that's going to feature in our procurement, to be honest. I think that's one for the Zero Carbon Oxford Partnership.
Yes. Well, that's what I'm thinking.
Think through. There's people in the university who know a lot more about that, and as they damn well should.
So that's back to Nick Ayres, is it?
Yeah, he might know a bit about that. Yeah, I'm not quite sure where his area of remit is. I mean, God knows how you actually work out carbon emissions embedded investments. I've no idea, but there are people working on it, I'm sure.
I think it's important, and I don't think that we should let it drop, even though it's not relevant to what Annette is telling us this evening. I don't want to go sideways away from you, Annette. It's too important for that. Should we move on to Imogen? You've got a question, Imogen.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. So on the BP and the greenwashing, it is something I thought about reading this, because if you look at the council's recent decisions, you see things, especially even with this procurement strategy, you see things like Barclays ordered new contracts, and then for me, I was thinking, oh, they've financed billions in fossil fuel projects since January last year. They're tax avoiders. They do forest in the Amazon, so it's not the best name. I understand we can't solve those broader problems, but I also do think we can be quite ambitious, especially considering we're not necessarily pioneering on this, and other councils have made great strides forward with alternative forms, in that example of banking. So I think it's good to keep pushing for the kind of ambitious changes, even if we can't solve all the world's problems. I guess off the back of that, I wanted to know what communication we have with other councils who've successfully adopted community wealth building approaches, and a little bit more. You touched on it and when you were talking, actually, which is great to know, but I'd like a little bit more detail if you have it. And also I'd like to ask if they would be consulted on the new strategy for their feedback with the benefit of their experience.
That would probably be another team other than me, so I don't know whether Tom's still online, whether we can perhaps ask as an action, whether we could perhaps ask Simon Grove Whites to perhaps.
I think we can certainly put the question out. So yeah.
Can I mention, as a response to Imogen's question away, on the EV strategy, we put forward a recommendation that ethical practices by various organisations ought to be taken into account when we looked at EV contracts. And that was rejected, that particular recommendation, on the basis that it wasn't realistic for us to be doing that. I just mention it because we have been pushed back on EV, and we could be pushed back again if we made a recommendation about insisting on ethical companies having contracts from us. I don't know what people think about that. I think Paula's raising her hand.
Yeah, sorry, I don't want to queue jump from Imogen, but
no,
it is okay.
In a moment.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think there's definitely like scope for that in like a full council, because there's so many areas, like with Dick's point and Imogen's point, where, you know, even when you look at our like pensions and where we're investing, like there's so much we can untangle, and it's too big for those types of reports. So I think in a full council we could properly flesh this out and try and get us to move into a direction that is, you know, investing ethically and away from the corrupt businesses that make a lot of money, but it's not you know,
I think the point that it's not actually a net's level of operation, if I can put it that way, to sort out the ethical status of the various companies with which we have to negotiate. Okay, Imogen, back to you.
Yeah, this is hopefully one that doesn't have to go away. It's on one of the amendments on number 9. It just says consideration of how value for money could be aligned with ethical standards. Is there any more detail on that? I know in the report we get page 15, a paragraph on value for money, which does include things like whole life cost. So it does kind of have that ethical basis, but I couldn't really glean much more understanding from that, because I suppose community wealth building already is thinking about how ethical approaches can actually have as an argument that those approaches can have a kind of aggregate economic return that is positive because of investing in the local labour force and skills and local economy, preventing like leaked surplus and that sort of thing. So yeah, just a little bit more information on that would be brilliant, to think about what the changes would actually be.
Yeah, at the moment, the answer is probably we don't know. It's what we're working on. So if anybody has any suggestions, please feed them through. But I think I think, you know, sometimes we get asked the questions, you know, if you buy local, if you're looking at all of these, the more you put into a contract, are the contracts costing us more money? So there's a big look at the whole value for money. We want to do local, we want to support new businesses, innovators, but does that cost us money? So it's a big look at how we're going to do that.
Okay, thank you. I've got a question, if I can put it now. It's about our wholly owned companies. And in a way, it's a question for Nigel as well, I think, because you're the chair of the companies panel. But it's about engagement in procurement between the city and ODS, OCHL, and the other companies, I suppose. You were saying that you do some of the buying for ODS, if I understood that right, earlier this evening. I don't understand what the relationship is in terms of the procurement for us and our wholly owned companies, whether they have a totally separate system and don't have Oxtoms and so on, as we're going to have shortly. And that we don't monitor what goes on within those companies. Maybe we're not in a position to do that under the constitution that we have with them. But if you could clarify a bit, that would be helpful.
So is that a question for me? Yes. Okay.
If you could start answering it, maybe I could.
Okay. So currently, the council do all of the buying for OCHL, so for the housing company. We don't do the buying for ODS or ODSTL. They've started to bring in their own procurement team. We do, however, where there are contracts that we feel it makes sense to go out once to the market and buy for the council and its entities, then we engage with the stakeholders from the areas internally and the companies to see whether they want to come on board with us. It's not something that we can force, but where there is deemed to be a benefit of going out on behalf of everybody, then we will do that. So we're about to go out for a lone worker solution, which all organisations do need. And so all the stakeholders are coming together for that. And we've done the printer contract recently, print and postage. We've gone out on behalf of everybody, internal audit. We've put in a contract for the council, for OCHL and ODS by going out once. So where we pick projects up early enough and where we can engage and where we see there's a benefit in doing that, then we engage with everybody to see whether they would like to come on board and whether we can get a solution that suits all parties.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a good question, Liz, and I think it's one that we need to pick up at the company scrutiny panel at some point. I mean, I think this work needs to move further forward, and then we need to have a conversation with them about how far are they subscribing to the same set of rules when they are doing procurement on their own, as against jointly with Annette's team and everybody else, the council side. And I'm intrigued by the answer to that question, really, to be honest, because I think in the end, you know, as a wholly owned company, they should be subscribing to the same values, and there shouldn't be really a fag packet, frankly, between the way they're procuring things and the way the council's procuring things. It's my personal view. We don't want a situation where they're running to a different set of values and weighting things in a different way to the council. I mean, I understand they've got to make a profit and a return, but it shouldn't be at the expense of ethics or expense of social value or whatever. And to be, you know, they're a doing good company, quote unquote, you know, on the side of every van I see at the moment when I'm driving around Oxford. So it's very hard to envisage a situation where they would have a set of procurement rules or weightings which were fundamentally different from those which are in this paper, to be honest with you. So I think we need to take this away and interrogate it.
I mean, I totally share your concerns about this, because in the end, as far as the public are concerned, the buck will stop with the city council, because
but also you're a wholly owned company. So in the end,
yes,
you don't have the right to wander off and have a different set of values from your shareholder. You know, I'm sorry, you know, that's not part of the deal, right? So I'm clear about that, and I will, you know, if I was still the ODS portfolio holder, I'd be making it absolutely clear to them.
Yes.
So I would, I think we'll pick this up at some point and ask them to come and talk about their procurement policy when this work's got a bit further, I would say.
Yes, I appreciate that, because at the moment, Annette's working from a very old policy, which
is going to be fundamentally revamped and improved.
And it is going to be very different once you've got your hands on it. I can tell that, and that's very positive. But you know, I do feel that there is a bit of an elephant in the room with the wholly owned companies apparently being allowed to have different procurement standards potentially. I don't even know if that's the case, but
I don't think they fundamentally do at the moment. I mean, all the evidence I have is that they didn't have their own kind of separate procurement policies, in inverted commas, which were different from these. Okay. But we need to make sure that as these get better, they don't lag behind, unless they have very, very good reasons why. And I'd love to know what they were. And profit. I mean, this is a very interesting discussion, isn't it? Because this is, how do you balance out financial return from a wholly owned company?
Yep.
It's one of its objectives, as against the way it behaves. And that's a very interesting kind of ethical, moral conversation. I know which way I land, which is values first. Always values first, because then you know, that dictates and governs your behavior, makes you a better company, and makes you work better with your employees and all those things. It's never profit first, because if you put profit nakedly first, you then corrupt your values, usually to some extent or another. So that's where I start from on it, and that's what I would say to them. I think we should have that conversation.
Yeah, I mean, it was flagged up for me in the report when you said that 63% of our contracts were with SMEs. I think that's
right.
You're right, but only 29% for our wholly owned companies, and I thought that was extraordinary. Actually, it's a side issue, but again, it is part of our procurement and how they're procuring. And I just see an alarm bell there.
Well, we can ask them at some point in the year to come forward and
Okay,
explain.
Yes.
What else we do, come forward and explain to the company scrutiny panel how they go about it, what are the rules of engagement, and if they're different from the council's new ones, why are they, frankly? Justify if they are. I know reasonably they are, but we can put them on the spot about it.
Okay, fine. Right, thank you very much. And you're engaging with them. I know, Annette, as a part of this overall work you're doing. Is that fairly straightforward? Did you find them easy to deal with?
Well, they've just gone through a big change. So I've had a couple of meetings with their new procurement manager and their commercial director. They've just brought in a new procurement specialist who I'm scheduling a meeting in with next week. So I am going to maintain and build the relationships with ODS, and I work quite closely with Helen Horn, who's the MD at OCHL, on some of their contracts as well.
I mean, to some extent, if you don't mind me saying so, you're almost like the canary in the mine, in that you are the first person who will see, therefore, if there's something that you're not really happy with in terms of the procurement that we do in the city. So I think to some extent that we're depending on you. Yeah, I'm sorry to call you a canary. It's because
it's fair
I'm from South Wales, where we have a lot of mines and quite a lot of canaries.
Probably been called worse than that.
Okay, fine, thank you. Can we move on to recommendations? I don't think we've got an awful lot for you, actually. I think you've been very helpful in your responses. But can I call upon Tom to tell us where he thinks we are with the recommendations, if any, for Annette?
Sure, Chair. So, Councillor Smoten, did you want to put forward the idea of monitor and report how often social value weightings actually change outcomes?
That and or just how often the candidate with the highest social value rating was the successful candidate.
Okay, I'll stick with what I've got because it's all written down already. Are
we happy with that recommendation? Yep. Imogen, you'd like to speak?
Thanks, Chair. Just another recommendation. Is that
fine? Yes. Okay.
Yeah. Okay. So one of them on my last question, I guess the wording would be, and I can send this in the chat, or I can send this to Tom afterwards. Changes made as headlined in Amendment 9 should work from a definition of value for money, which is consistent with community wealth building principles, which the council is committed to. They should also always be measured alongside factors such as whole life cost, good value investment in the local labour force, surplus leakage avoided, and indirect costs associated with lengthening the supply chain. It's just because without more detail on that, I don't know if it's going to kind of take everything apart at the seams and prioritise a value for money definition that we've moved away from explicitly as a council, which is probably me being paranoid, but yeah, are people generally happy with that?
Yeah. Personally, I'm very happy with that, and I hope Annette will find that helpful as a recommendation.
Thank you.
Yeah, could I ask that you send it through to Tom on an email, and then Tom, can you?
Yes, so what will happen is that because this isn't a cabinet report, it'll actually come back to scrutiny to be signed off at the next meeting. So it's going to take 2 weeks before the actual final document is signed off and sort of ready. But I can share that draft with you because I hope that it won't be changed subsequently. But yeah, sure.
Thank you.
Yes, Imogen.
sorry, I have more.
Another
on, and this again, this is a question that we don't know the answer to yet, but just in case, to approach pioneering community wealth building councils such as Preston to comment on our procurement strategy, bringing with them the benefit of their experience, and then for their feedback to be passed on to Cabinet and to Scrutiny.
Can I just answer that? I did go to Preston after the last Scrutiny meeting. We did ask them for some feedback, and they didn't feed back. So we can try again.
It wouldn't have to be Preston, would it? It could be Bristol, for instance, which has got a reasonably good record for procurement.
Yeah, they do.
Do you have the time and the person power to actually do this? That's the other thing I'd
not immediately, no. I mean, we can sort of put an email to them and ask them. So that wouldn't take too long to do that, and either myself or one of the team would be able to do that.
I think that would be valuable if you could. I mean, it doesn't have to be Bristol or indeed Preston, but wherever seems appropriate to you.
Okay.
Nigel.
I want to return to Imogen's, I think it was Imogen's point about ethical standards.
Yeah.
I mean, the fact that the Cabinet rejected our last recommendation around ethical standards doesn't mean we shouldn't ask them about it again. And I am quite concerned about that, actually, because of potential reputational damage to the council. If you procure from a company who's got all sorts of, dodgy stuff, frankly, going on in their record about, some of the things that Imogen outlined, which is funding, regimes, working with, Barclays is a very good example, actually. Then I think that is a proper consideration that needs to be taken into account in awarding contracts. And to say, well, actually, we can't do any work on that, it's all on a too difficult pile, we can't do due diligence. In other areas I work in, where we award contracts or we take funds from organizations to fund, charitable activity, we are crawling all over those companies in terms of due diligence about whether they are fit and proper partners for us to have. And so I kind of don't really accept that, sorry, that's just too difficult to do. Because if you end up with the wrong partner, it then becomes clear that, they've been doing some things you really wish you'd never had a partnership with. That can be amazingly damaging for your reputation. You have to withdraw from the contract. The press and media is absolutely horrible. And you damage your reputation, all because you didn't do enough due diligence in the first place. And so I don't really accept that, Liz, actually. I think we need to push harder. Yeah. It's not a political point. This is a fundamental point about kind of what sort of council do we want to be, in the end? Do we really want to have partnerships with people who've got areas in their past or in their current behaviour which is frankly unacceptable? And I don't really want to be part of an organisation that does that.
I'd like to hear Annette on this. She's already touched on it when she was talking previously, but I think the point I'd make is that it's easy enough for us to look at the ethical dimension of a small company locally. It's much harder if what we have to contract with is a great big national, international company.
Well, with respect to this, I don't agree, because actually there's usually more evidence on the record.
Yes.
I could do you a due diligence check on Barclays a lot faster than I can do raw workshop in Blackburn Leeds, frankly, because there'll be hardly anything about the raw workshop in Blackburn Leeds in the public domain about its ethical behaviour. There's a hell of a lot about Barclays behaviour, which charities and NGOs spend their time investigating, and then you have to come to a view as to whether you want to be partners with them. So I don't really accept that. Okay. I'm going to challenge you back, all right, and say,
fine. I hear what you say. Annette,
I think maybe it just needs to be a bit more specific, because if we've got over 500 contracts that we're dealing with that level of suppliers, that's actually a huge task to undertake. Whereas if you were being more specific, perhaps about the level.
Well, you could look at the scale of the contract. You could look at the length of it. You could look at all those things. I mean, I agree. You'd have to lay some criteria down, but
yeah.
The bigger ones, the really big ones, it would be pretty obvious pretty quickly that there'd be a sort of threshold where you'd be nervous if you didn't do any due diligence about them.
I mean, a lot of the suppliers, when they tender on the bigger contracts, will self-certify.
Yeah.
So that is undertaken as a base minimum self-certification.
Okay. So So a recommendation about this, or maybe, I don't know whether, you know, that if that's any help or if you feel you've already covered it enough, but I just think it needs a bit more emphasis, if I can put it that way, than it has at the moment.
I think we're happy to put it as a recommendation to our committee. I can see Paula nodding her head, but she also had her hand up, which has now vanished.
Yeah, no, it's good. I was just going to echo what Nigel was saying, but kind of say that, you know, while I agree wholeheartedly with him, it does open a huge can of worms, because the council invests in quite a lot, you know, with our pensions, there's, you know, we're investing in companies that are in violation of human rights. We've got, you know, fossil fuel problems. It's huge, and I'd love to tackle it personally, but I guess the procurement's one thing, but then there's, like, you know, much bigger fights to have as well. But I'd be on board, Nigel, definitely.
I can see hands from Linda and Imogen, and another hand from Nigel, which I think is an update.
It's an old hand. Mine's an old hand.
It's an old hand, right? Linda.
Just a quick observation. I think this is a time when it might have been useful actually to have a council lawyer with us, because I think, you know, the difference for us in local government and big charities or other organisations is the law is fairly tight about this, about you know, the reasons that councils can actually give for not working with a company. So yeah, it's a shame we haven't got that legal advice here, so we can have a more informed discussion. And I think that's probably why our previous recommendation was rejected when it got to cabinet.
Right. Well, the thing that I can undertake to do is to contact Emma Griffiths, who is our special lawyer. She actually belongs to the Scrutiny Committee, even though she doesn't attend our meetings. So I will contact her about this if it goes forward to a recommendation, and see what her view is, if everybody's happy that I do that. Yeah, I agree with you. We fought quite hard to actually have a lawyer present at our meetings, and we were told that they just didn't have the person power to manage it, and we had to accept that eventually. Imogen, your hand is up.
Yeah, okay, last thing from me, but one of the things I found was really opaque, really trying to look into what we do and how we do it, is that the kind of matrices that we use to determine contracts change all the time, the weightings change all the time, the criteria. So it's quite difficult to think about what criteria we're assessing, because the answer will often be, oh, but it changes every time. But we still have an approach, even if it changes every time. And if Scrutiny can't access that information, it's really difficult for us to know whether it's working well or not. So I suppose the recommendation, which is very hard to word, is that I would like greater availability of information about the principles underlying the choices we make about those changing weightings and criteria. So it's hard to generalize. I understand that. It's very hard to give an indicative contract, but we need to know what the approach is. And I know it's very difficult to say, here's a matrix, here's how we weighed this particular thing, so we can look at it and scrutinize it as we normally would a table. But I do think we can get more detail that we're not. So other members might be able to word it or might have some thoughts on that. And I suppose at the moment it's not quite a recommendation, but that's the problem I've had in trying to scrutinise this. And I know other councils, such as Preston, publish their matrices, you know, screenshots of what their matrices might look like at least. And thank you very much, Annette, for saying you'll send me kind of the 5 most recent decisions we've made on this, because that will be something. But I think we are missing that detail.
We can send you the template, because we do have a template evaluation document, but it's just the questions and the weighting that goes against those questions will change subject to whether you're going to a 70-30 split in terms of quality price, or 60-40 or 50-50. So that's what will change. And then the questions that the service areas will want to ask to get the product or the service that they want at the end.
You're frozen.
Whilst we're waiting for Annette hopefully to come back, would something like a description of the principles that determine social value weightings in contract tenders be, so that, does that summarise
It does, and off the back of what Annette started to say, if there is that information, could it be every time we talk about kind of procurement as scrutiny, could that be in front of us? Yeah, thanks, Tom.
I think we might have lost her, Chair, so
right. Oh dear.
Probably it may be worth just wrapping that up.
Can we just check that we've got all the recommendations so far? I don't want to miss any of them out. Okay. Can you just go through them very quickly, Tom?
So monitoring how it impacts outcomes.
That's Chris's recommendation, isn't it?
Yeah.
Okay.
I have got something. I have no idea what my notes mean, so I will end up having to go back to that one. But it's Imogen's first recommendation that she's going to send me. Hopefully, second. The likewise, Imogen's made one about approaching other councils with strong backgrounds in procurement and community wealth building for feedback on our prospective changes, etc. And then something around driving ethical standards in our bigger contracts. But yeah, I'll have a go, and then because we're coming back, we can look at that.
Could you speak to Nigel about that, because he had some pretty good wording for that.
Yeah,
which we should be able to use, I think.
And then the final one, description of the principles that determine social value weightings in contract tenders, and ensuring that that's available to scrutiny when it discusses procurement issues.
Yes. Okay.
I missed any out?
Certainly. Hosni was speaking about our soft power over anchor institutions, and Annette mentioned Simon Grove White, who was working on
it would be great to say something about use every opportunity, including economic strategy, to encourage anchor institutions to use similar.
From my knowledge, because this has come up in Finance and Performance panel, from my knowledge of other things, I think that they are actually working and discussing with some of the other anchor institutions on this development of Oxtom's stuff. So that was something that was spoken about previously at a Finance and Performance panel meeting. So yes, we can always add something to say more, please, but it's not completely ignored, and I think it is sort of underway.
Thank you. And the last of Imogen's points, recommendations, you could use just a word, I guess, transparency might be the words we're looking for, really.
Yes. Yeah, a greater availability of information about principles, which you're talking about transparency. It's a good word. About the principles underlying, the criteria, So we're not going to do one about Simon Grove White and anchor institutions at the moment. I mean, it wouldn't be specifically about him, but about exerting what power we can over ensuring anchor institutions behave in an appropriate way. Anybody in favour of that, or should we just?
I think so.
Okay, so that's Hosni's recommendation. If we can tidy it up a bit.
Yeah.
Great, super. Right, are we through with that? Don't want to hurry anybody, but it is 8:30. Okay, right. Can we move on, guys? Thank you. This is over to Tom, I think, because he very kindly attended at the last cabinet meeting and is going to report back on recommendations from the Scrutiny Committee and from its panels. Okay, so over to you, Tom.
Cheers. So there were quite a few reports. Workplace equalities, everything was agreed, so I won't bother talking about that. Strategic grants, 2 recommendations that were made were both turned down. The first one was sort of turned down because they disagreed with the principle. The second one about the Oxford Lottery, they were keen to implement and actually were keen to extend it beyond what Scrutiny had recommended. But for legal reasons, they were unable to do so. So they said they wouldn't do it, but not because they didn't want to, just because it wasn't possible. Asset management strategy was all agreed. The air quality, Councillor Hayes wasn't at the that meeting, so it was quite it was quite brief, the response that was given, and there weren't a huge number of sort of agreed, disagreed in the actual reply to Scrutiny, but it seems that a lot of the work is sort of currently underway in one form or another that Scrutiny's recommendations focused on. Carbon and housing and carbon reduction, that report was all agreed. And then the tourism review group update. If you're very, very eagle-eyed, you may have noticed that in the cabinet papers, the responses came back saying that all the recommendations were agreed. But what you see in front of you, the 4th recommendation at the bottom about reviewing the recommendations made by the tourism review group, that at cabinet was actually far more sort of equivocal, and basically they were saying that rather than the recommendations being reviewed in light of the new strategies that have been developed, the new strategies have been developed in light partially of Scrutiny's recommendations. So it was just switching the order, but it had been listened to. So that's why I sort of demoted that, if you like, to a partially. But yeah, and those are all the reports we have.
Thank you very much, Tom. Right, so moving back to the agenda, I think it's just next meeting, isn't it?
If we're short for time, then yes. I mean, we could ask Nigel and Linda to give a brief update from the previous meetings of the housing and companies panels, but if people are wanting to get moving, then
I could do it in about a minute, so it's very quick. I mean, well, basically we went in with 2 recommendations, if you remember. One was about the corporate dashboard and about sustainability, and everybody accepted that. That was very important to include that and find the right indicators. The second issue was about Redbridge Park and Ride and why it's taken so long to come to a view as to why Redbridge wasn't the right place for ODS and all the costs. And to be fair, the cabinet members around the committee had already kind of agreed to do that sort of review because they were also worried about the same issues. So that review is underway. And on the other issues that, Tom does a very good aid memoir, which is covers about 10, 15 areas. And they're very, I mean, to be fair, if we weren't there, we're asking all the difficult questions, if I can be honest with you off the record now. I mean, we're coming in and being given the space because we've done the homework. And we're setting the scene and setting the tempo, I think it's fair to say, of the meeting, which is exactly how it should be. And we're given lots of space to ask the questions that we want to ask, which we've already agreed through the company scrutiny panel to ask. So James Fry and I were in attendance, and we basically shared them out between us. And we got assurance on the things we wanted assurance about. I mean, like why was there a big swing in the numbers towards the end of the year? They explained all of that. What are they doing about efficiency? I mean, one of the things that came out was also efficiency. and how can they drive down costs in a sensible way to make them more successful in bidding for contracts, particularly building construction contracts where they had a pretty average record so far. So they explained all of that. They went through it in quite a lot of detail. And then we finally had a presentation, everybody had a presentation around Project Dominion, which is the building repairs system of delivery of parts to support a better and more efficient building repair system of council houses. And they went through that again at some length. And I think everybody went away feeling pretty happy that there was they'd made some real strides forward to try and get repairs done, in one go, rather than keeping to come backwards endlessly to fiddle around the edges. Now, that's what they're saying. I mean, I think all ward councils have examples where that has not worked as well as it should, and therefore we need to keep the pressure on that issue to say, does your rhetoric meet your reality here? But I think they've got a good, they've got a much better supply parts system with Grafton in place than they had before. So I think it was a positive meeting. And I think it's working well, actually. It's nice to have James or another member of the company scrutiny panel with me so we can share out the load a bit and we can ask some telling questions, really.
It's a powerful system.
And they're listening.
No.
I can assure you they're listening hard.
Yes.
The answers.
You should see the results as time goes on.
There's no brush off going on, far from it, exactly the opposite. They're listening hard.
Great.
And then we're going in well briefed after our initial conversations with a good note from Tom to help us, which we shared in advance with them so they know where we're coming from, so they can do their homework, get prepared to answer the right questions. And we must have asked about 80% of the questions. I would say that meeting, which is good.
Yeah, I wonder how they managed before the new system.
Well, I think they didn't have it. Wasn't as streamlined or efficient, was it? That was the truth.
Okay, fine. Right. I don't think we've got Linda anymore. So she's not going to be able to brief us on the housing and homelessness panel.
I can give you a sort of 1 minute summary just of the topics that were looked at. So housing performance Q2, so just a general overview, but also the ongoing sort of looking at tenant engagement, and the topic that was looked at this time was the tenant satisfaction survey and the responses to that, i.e. the information coming in and then the council's response subsequently to getting that information and what it would be doing about it. So yeah, it was a useful meeting. Neither one actually had any recommendations, but the recommendations will probably come up for the tenant engagement stuff in time for the April meeting. So that's kind of where it's going to go.
Thank you very much, Tom, and thanks for attending on my behalf at that meeting. I appreciated that. Okay, anything else, or are we on to the final item, dates of future meetings? Okay, I think that's pretty straightforward. Any problems?
Yes, Chair, there's just the one thing to say that we do have items scheduled for that meeting. So sometimes scrutiny is cancelled when PERDA happens, but we are planning to go ahead with that. So just to sort of note that and don't bank on it being cancelled.
It's an evening free of canvassing, can't be better than
That's your thing.
I look forward to it. Well, thank you very much, everybody. And thank you particularly to Alice, who has sat through her very first scrutiny committee without collapsing, as far as I can see. So I'm particularly grateful to you. And see everybody on the 1st of February. No time at all away. Okay.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks,
Thank
Liz.
you. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, everyone.